What if the will of fire was never just an ideology? What if it was a living force that existed before chakra, before villages, before gods? In a reality where He shinobi world survives the fourth great ninja war, Naruto Uzumaki uncovers a truth buried deeper than the Sage of Six Paths himself. The will of fire did not begin in Konoha, it was born in the first reality. And it has been burning across dimensions ever since, searching for a vessel strong enough to carry its flame without being consumed. This is the story of a Naruto who doesn't just become Hokage. He becomes the Primordial Harem King, the living source of the will of fire itself. With Hinata, Sakura, Ino, Temari, Mei, and a purified Kaguya standing beside him, not as trophies, but as eternal pillars of his power, Naruto rises beyond time, beyond worlds, beyond destiny. As forgotten gods awaken, as realities where Naruto never existed begin to collapse, and as the Ash Sovereign prepares to extinguish the flame of hope forever, one question will decide the fate of every universe. Can the will of fire survive when it is forced to burn across all realities at once? This is not just a what if. This is the legend of how Naruto Uzumaki became the eternal flame of existence itself. Welcome to Will of Fire Stories. Chapter 1. The Catalyst at the End of All Things. The village of Konohagakure burned. Not in the conventional sense, there were no flames, no smoke that rose to darken the sky. Rather, it was as if the very concept of the village was being unmade, thread by thread, reality string by reality string. The buildings did not collapse, they faded, their existence becoming negotiable with each passing moment. The people did not scream, their voices had already been erased from causality itself. Their final cries existing only in the memory of a universe that was forgetting them. Naruto Uzumaki stood at the center of this geometric nightmare, his eyes wide with the particular horror that comes from bearing witness to the end of everything. He had seen many wars. He had fought many enemies. But this transcended the language of conflict. This was the language of erasure. Around him, in a perfect circle, stood 7 figures. They were not gods in the traditional sense, though 7 different pantheons would have called them such. They were architects of the multiverse itself, entities that predated the concept of being, that had written the rules by which existence could operate. They called themselves the primordial consensus, the collective will that had decided whether realities lived or died, whether timelines expanded or contracted, whether souls could persist beyond their designated narratives. Their spokesman was a being of such impossible geometry that Naruto's mind could only process him as a contradiction. Part dragon, part void, part mathematical equation. He had introduced himself once, and the name had taken 17 minutes to fully pronounce. Most simply called him Void That Speaks, and even that was a simplification so profound it bordered on heresy. The will of fire, Void That Speaks said, his voice creating echoes in realities that did not yet exist. As the final corrupting element, it is the variable we cannot control. It is the narrative thread that refuses to follow our calculus. Naruto's fists clenched, and the action itself became an event of cosmic significance. The very air around his hands began to crystallize into fractals of pure meaning. Within him, the 9-tailed fox, no longer merely a beast, but an ancient progenitor force that predated demons themselves, roared with a ferocity that shattered time in a 3-mile radius. "You're killing them," Naruto said, and his words were not spoken but existed, hanging in the space between dimensions like a fact too important to be subjected to something as trivial as sound waves. "You're killing everyone." "We are correcting an error," replied one of the other entities. A being of pure crystalline light that had once been the avatar of 1,000 dead universes. "Your reality is a paradox. It should not exist. By all calculations, its hold have collapsed in on itself 500 years ago. The only reason it persists is because of you, because of your will, your choices, your refusal to accept predetermined outcomes. You are chaos wearing human form. You are the antithesis of order." Naruto felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing, pressing down on him from all directions, from all dimensions, from all possible angles of approach. They were right. In a way, he had always been the wild card, the variable that no one could account for. In his childhood, the village had seen him as a demon. As a teenager, he had been a shadow of promise. As an adult, he had become something that transcended the normal categories of power and weakness, hero and villain, chosen one and nobody. But it was in the moment after that recognition that something fundamental shifted within him. It was not a transformation in the traditional sense. Transformations implied a before and after, a clear demarcation point. What happened to Naruto Uzumaki in that instant transcended such linear thinking. He did not become something greater, rather, he recognized what he had always been, what he had always had the potential to be. The realization rippled backward through his timeline, forward into futures that did not yet exist, sideways into parallel realities where different versions of himself were facing different variations of this same impossible moment. In the timeline where he had become a farmer, he felt it. In the reality where he had died young, he felt it. In the infinite branching paths of multiverse possibility, every iteration of Naruto Uzumaki felt that same awakening, that same impossible synthesis. The primordial consensus perceived it almost too late. By the time they began to react, Naruto had already transcended the physical plane, moved beyond the metaphysical plane, and begun to rewrite the very substrate of possibility itself. He did not fight them with jutsu. Jutsu were merely local expressions of power, bound by the rules of a single universe. Instead, he fought them with something older, something that had been sleeping within him since before he was born, since before Anion. He remembered what his true designation was. He fought them with the will of fire itself, but not as a mere concept or philosophy. The will of fire, he understood now, was not just the determination to protect loved ones. It was not just the stubborn refusal to give up. It was the fundamental force that kept consciousness alive, that made choice possible, that ensured that the future could never be entirely predetermined. It was the antithesis of entropy. It was the rebellion against the heat death of all meaning. As his power expanded, Naruto felt something else, a presence beside him, behind him, woven into the very fabric of his being. It was Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, but not as a separate entity. Their bond, forged through years of struggle and understanding, had evolved beyond the typical Jinchuriki connection. They were not master and beast, host and parasite. They were one, perfectly integrated, two aspects of a single consciousness that was somehow more complete for containing multitude. But that was only the beginning. From the elemental nations, from every village and every hidden corner of the world, he felt them reaching toward him. Not in a physical sense, but in a way that transcended physical reality. Hinata, whose Byakugan had once been limited to a few hundred meters of sight, now perceived across dimensions, across realities, her gentle but absolute indomitable will adding its strength to his. Sakura, whose strength had once been measured only in physical might, now wielded the power to heal not just bodies but the very wounds that existence itself had inflicted upon reality. Ino, whose mind transfer jutsu had once allowed her to touch only the thoughts of her immediate vicinity, now walked freely through the landscape of consciousness itself, binding souls together in patterns of impossible beauty. And there were others, so many others. Tamari, whose wind jutsu had always carried within it the potential to break walls, now bent the very winds of causality itself. Tenten, whose sealing scrolls had contained weapons from every era, now sealed entire concepts, removing the possibility of failure and doubt from the minds of those she touched. Kushina, who had returned to this moment from the beyond through a connection that transcended death itself, her chains of love binding the fundamental forces of the universe together with her indomitable determination. Each one of them was a pillar. Each one of them was a queen. Each one of them was a goddess in her own right, wielding power that would have shattered the minds of the gods from the old pantheons. But more than that, they were unified, a collective consciousness that thought with one heart while maintaining the beautiful complexity of individual perspective and choice. This was not the simple romantic fantasy of a harem. This was something far more profound, the recognition that the deepest power in the multiverse came not from dominance or singular might, but from the perfect synthesis of complementary forces, from the harmony that could only exist when multiple wills chose, at every moment, to move together. Void that speaks perceived this developing, and made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been the dying scream of a universe that had just been erased. Impossible. You have corrupted the very fabric of. But Naruto was no longer listening. He did not defeat the primordial consensus through confrontation. Instead, he did something far more radical. He rewrote them, not destroyed them, not even truly fought them. He took the fundamental rules by which they operated and gently, inexorably, guided those rules toward a new configuration. The entities that had been the primordial consensus had believed that order was synonymous with control. That predictability required the elimination of free will. But Naruto showed them, in a moment that lasted both an instant and an eternity, that there was a deeper order. one that could contain chaos and unpredictability and still remain fundamentally stable. It was the order of love. It was the order of choice. It was the order of the will of fire, expressed across every dimension, every timeline, every possible state of existence. As the primordial consensus was unmade and remade simultaneously, as the rules of reality bent toward a new cosmology, Naruto felt something else awakening within him. It was not a new power, but rather the recognition of a power that had always been there, inherent in every human heart that had ever chose to love rather than hate, to hope rather than despair, to become rather than accept what they had been given. He was becoming something that transcended the category of Harem King, in the conventional sense. He was becoming a nexus point, a living expression of the principle that true strength came not from dominance over others, but from the willing synthesis of many into an infinitely greater whole. And the women who surrounded him, Hinata, Sakura, Ino, and all the others, were not his possessions or his conquests. They were his equals, his mirrors, his necessary counterbalances. They were the other half of every equation. They were the completion that made transcendence possible. In the space between spaces, in that moment where reality was still being rewritten, a new force began to take shape. Not a god, not a demon, not a juggernaut of raw power, but something far more dangerous. The primordial harem king was being born. And all across the multiverse, all across the infinite branching paths of possibility, every version of everyone who had ever loved Naruto Uzumaki, who had ever believed in him, who had ever helped him reach for the next dream, they all felt it, that moment when the fabric of their universe shifted on its axis and began to turn toward a new destiny. Chapter 2, The Revelation of the Eternal Feminine. In the space between heartbeats, Hinata Hyuga existed. Not just physically, though her body was there, standing in that impossible space where reality bent like water around a stone. She existed across all of her iterations, all of her possibilities. She was the Hinata who had been too shy to speak her name clearly, and she was the Hinata who had fought at the front lines of the Great Wars. She was the Hinata who had survived, and she was the Hinata who had fallen and never risen again, because in this moment, death was negotiable, time was optional, and the boundaries between different states of being had become suggestions rather than laws. Her Byakugan, those pale eyes that had always been the mark of her noble birth, now operated on a scale that transcended physical sight. She could perceive not just the bodies of her enemies, but the narrative threads that bound them to existence. She could see the moments where choice intersected with fate, where free will grappled with predetermined outcome. She could see, with absolute clarity, the web of connection that bound her to Naruto Uzumaki across every possible timeline, every possible universe. Their connection was ancient, not ancient in the sense of years, they had known each other for only decades. But ancient in the sense of fundamental, in the sense of being written into the base code of reality itself. In every universe where they both existed, in every timeline ere they both had the chance to make choices, their lives had moved toward each other with the inexorable force of gravity. In some realities they had been lovers. In others, they had been rivals. In still others, they had been strangers who passed in the night, never quite touching, carrying an ache that neither could fully explain. But in this reality, in this moment, they were becoming something far greater. Naruto, she spoke, and her voice carried the weight of every Hinata that had ever been, ever could be. I can see it now. I can see the path we take together. Beside her, Sakura, a Haruno moved her hands through patterns of pure medical force. But she was not healing simple wounds. She was performing surgery on reality itself, cutting away the scar tissue that the primordial consensus had left behind. The deep wounds that their attempts at control had carved into the very substance of existence. Her chakra had always been remarkable, even legendary in its own right, but now it was enhanced by something more profound. She was channeling not just her own strength, but the accumulated healing potential of every person who had ever been saved by her hands, every life she had ever preserved. The damage is extensive, Sakura said, her tone clinical even as tears streamed down her face. The fundamental fabric of causality has been torn. If we don't reinforce the structure soon, entire timelines will start to collapse. But there was no fear in her voice, only determination. This was the true nature of Sakura Haruno that few truly understood. She was not simply a medic who happened to be strong. She was the principle of restoration given human form, the embodiment of the refusal to accept that any wound was permanent, that any damage was beyond repair. In a mall, Tiverse where entropy was fighting for dominance, where the forces of disorder pressed in from all sides, Sakura's existence was an act of rebellion. Ino Yamanaka, meanwhile, had moved into a state that transcended the physical entirely. Her consciousness had expanded to encompass what she called the landscape of hearts, the place where all souls could be perceived as they truly were, before personality, before identity. Before the filtering mechanisms of individual ego began to separate one being from another. She could see that Naruto was not one person but infinite people, each one a different facet of the same eternal principle. And she could see that this was true of everyone else as well, that the separation between self and other was always somewhat illusory, that the deepest truth was unity attempting to express itself through the medium of diversity. "They're here," Ino said, and her words had the quality of a prophecy, a statement of something that was both already true and in the process of becoming true. "All of them, everyone who has ever loved him, everyone he has ever touched. They're all coming, they're all reaching for him. And he's reaching back, from across the dimensional boundaries. From realities that barely qualified as existent, from the spaces between one heartbeat and the next, they began to arrive." Tamari came first, her wind jutsu having evolved into something that could navigate not just physical space but the space between spaces. She moved with the grace of a warrior queen, her hair still held up by those characteristic jewels, her expression one of absolute focus and deadly capability. "The Sand Village is secure," she reported, "always professional, always duty-bound. We've stabilized our sector of reality. The daimyo are prepared to channel their will through the same circuit that Naruto is using. The Land of Wind stands ready." Tenten was not far behind, moving with the speed that came from a lifetime of practice and perfect efficiency. Her sealing scrolls had multiplied beyond the normal laws of logistics. She now carried weapons from timelines that might never have existed, tools of power that had been created only for this moment. Contingency plans for contingencies that no one else had thought to imagine. "All sectors report readiness," she said, checking through what appeared to be a clipboard but was actually a scroll that contained more information than the entire library of Alexandria could have held in its physical form. "The eternal blades are in position. The sealing matrices are calibrated. If the signal comes, we can lock down any reality that threatens to destabilize." Kushina's return from the beyond had been the most shocking, the most impossible. She was Naruto's mother, but she was also something far more, a force of nature given form, a woman whose determination had been strong enough to reach across the boundary between life and death itself. Her crimson hair seemed to glow with an inner light, and her chains, those fearsome chains that had once bound the nine-tailed fox, now hung loose at her sides, no longer tools of restraint but instruments of binding, of bringing Toget. Her things that the universe wanted to keep apart. "My son," she said, and there was a tenderness in her voice that did not diminish her absolute power. "I have walked the paths beyond death. I have seen the place where all timelines converge. I know what you are attempting to do. And I am here to tell you that it is possible. Difficult, yes. Dangerous, yes. But possible." "Mother," Naruto said, and his voice was filled with a complexity of emotion that transcended simple filial affection. He was grieving and joyful, humbled and empowered, all at once. "I never thought I would see you again. I could not stay away." Kushina replied, "Not at a moment like this. Not when the fate of existence itself hangs in the balance. And there were others, so many others. Conan, whose paper jutsu could now fold reality itself into new configurations. Mei Terumi, whose boiling technique had evolved into the power to reduce any unwanted element to its component parts and reconstitute it as something new. Tsunade, whose strength had never truly faded but merely deepened, becoming the kind of power that could support the weight of nations, the weight of worlds, the weight of multiverses. Each one of them was a pillar in their own right. Each one of them had transcended the limitations of their original power set and evolved into something that could only be described as transcendent. But more than that, more importantly than that, they were all unified in their purpose, moving with the coordination of a single organism that happened to contain multiple hearts, multiple minds, multiple perspectives. This was what Naruto had been working toward, though he had not fully understood it until this moment. Not romantic conquest, not dominance, not the gathering of power through the subjugation or possession of other beings. Instead, it was the recognition that true power, power that could reshape the multiverse itself, came from perfect harmony, from the synchronization of multiple wills that had chosen to move together, that had chosen to believe in the same dream. The Primordial Harem King, it became clear, was not a title that indicated possession or control. It was a title that indicated synthesis. The ability to become a focal point where different streams of power could converge without destroying each other, where different perspectives could merge without losing their essential character. Hinata, perceiving this realization through the lens of her evolved Byakugan, moved closer to Naruto. Her pale eyes locked with his blue ones, and in that moment of connection, something profound shifted in the fabric of reality itself. "We are one," she said, not as a romantic statement, but as a statement of fundamental metaphysical truth. "We have always been one. Across every timeline, in every reality, our souls have recognized each other. And now, finally, we have the power and the understanding to act on that recognition." She reached out her hand, and when she did, the others followed suit. Not in physical imitation, but in spiritual resonance. Each one of them reached toward the center, toward the nexus point that was Naruto Uzumaki. And as their hands came together, hands that represented different villages, different nations, different philosophies, something extraordinary began to happen. The will of fire, that principle that had always been unique to Konohagakure, that had always been painted as a purely masculine assertion of will and determination, revealed its deeper truth. It was not a male principle at all. It was something infinitely more subtle and infinitely more powerful. It was the eternal flame, the eternal light that burned at the heart of existence itself. And it was female, not because of any biological reality, but because its fundamental nature was creative, generative, nurturing, even in the context of the most epic battles and the highest stakes. The eternal feminine, that principle which had been suppressed, and hidden and distorted throughout history, now rose to full expression. It was not separate from the masculine principle that Naruto embodied, but rather its necessary complement, the completing other half of every equation. In that moment, a new covenant was written across the multiverse. It was not a romantic comedy moment, despite how it might have seemed to the uninitiated observer. It was the moment when the universe recognized that its future would be determined not by a single will imposing order through sheer force, but by multiple wills moving in harmony, by strength that had been tempered by compassion, by power that had been balanced by wisdom. The Primordial Harem King and his queens, no, not queens in the sense of being subordinate to a king, but rather as co-creators, co-rulers, co-architects of the new reality that was being born, stood together in the space between spaces, and they began to speak. Not in words, but in concepts, in ideas, in fundamental expressions of will that transcended language. And the multiverse listened, and the multiverse changed. Chapter 3. The Shattering of the Old Rules. Time, as a concept, had never been particularly reliable in the presence of high-level shinobi. But what Naruto and his allies were doing now went far beyond making time behave strangely. They were not bending time, not even breaking it. They were rewriting it, creating new temporal topologies that operated according to different rules, different principles. The old order, the system that had been established by the primordial consensus, had been based on a simple principle: entropy always increases. Matter tends toward disorder. Energy dissipates. Consciousness fades. Every timeline is destined for heat death. Every universe tends toward void. But this principle, fundamental as it appeared, was not actually fundamental at all. It was merely a rule that had been established by those who had the power to establish rules. And now that rule was being revised. Sakura stood in the center of a space that was neither inside nor outside any particular reality, wielding tools of healing that had evolved far beyond the simple restoration of flesh. She could perceive the fundamental architecture of causality, see the places where the old order had enforced entropy, had forced decay and dissolution upon every system. And she was undoing it, one strand at a time. "The work is immense," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of one who was fighting against the weight of fundamental laws. "In this sector alone, there are 7 civilizations that had already been erased by entropy. They exist only as memories in the quantum substrate. To restore them fully would require all of us," Naruto finished, reaching out to place his hand over hers. The contact created a cascade of healing energy that spread outward in concentric circles, reaching across realities, touching every point where Sakura's earlier attempts at restoration had begun. "That's why we're here. That's why we're all here." The strength that flowed through that simple point of contact was almost incomprehensible. It was the strength of a man who had already transcended the limitations of physical form, who had learned to move as pure will through the multiverse. But it was also the strength of a woman who had spent her entire life perfecting the art of restoration. Of taking what was broken and making it whole again. Together, the two of them created something that neither could have managed alone. Around them, the work continued. Tamari had taken command of what she called the wind sectors, those regions of the multiverse where the element of air held particular sway, where the principle of movement and change was most naturally expressed. She was consciously working against entropy in those sectors, using her power to break down the barriers between different timelines, allowing them to share resources, to support each other. To create networks of mutual aid that the old order would have forbidden as destructive. The daimyo are asking for a timeline, Tamari reported, her tone suggesting she already knew what the answer would be. They want to know when we can transition the land of wind fully to the new system. They're concerned about the social disruption, the instability. Tell them that instability is not our enemy, Naruto replied. His attention still divided between a dozen different tasks, 100 different realities, 1,000 different crises that needed to be simultaneously addressed and resolved. The old order offered them stability, stability in decline, stability in decay. What we're building offers them something far more valuable. We're offering them possibility. We're offering them the chance to choose their own future, even if that future is uncertain. Ino, moving through the landscape of hearts, was experiencing something closer to revelation. The collective consciousness of humanity, all the souls that had ever lived, all the souls that would ever live, was stirring, waking up to the possibility of something new. They had been told, for eons, that the trajectory of existence was toward dissolution. That the best they could do was to accept entropy and try to postpone the final darkness as long as possible. Now they were being told something different. The souls are rebelling, Ino said, and there was wonder in her voice. They're rejecting the premise of entropy entirely. I can feel it spreading like a contagion through the collective unconscious. It's not about achieving immortality or escaping death, it's about rejecting the idea that death must be the final word, that existence must inevitably tend toward dissolution. Hinata, her Byakuga, expanded to perceive dimensions beyond the normal range of human sensation, began to map out what she called the network of will. This was not a physical network, but rather the underlying structure of connection that bound all sentient beings together. The old order had tried to sever this network, to isolate individuals, to prevent the flow of will between them, believing that separation was the key to control. But Hinata was doing the opposite. She was strengthening the connections, deepening the resonance between souls, creating pathways of understanding where there had previously been only walls of separation and isolation. I can see something, she said, her pale eyes glowing with inner light. A pattern emerging across multiple timelines. It's not just us, not just the people of this world. There are others, humans like us but from different realities, different configurations of the multiverse, who are waking up to the same recognition. The power to reshape reality is not unique to us. It's inherent in anyone who has the will to imagine something different, to believe in something beyond what they've been told is possible. This revelation was profound in its implications. It meant that what Naruto was accomplishing was not a singular event, but rather the catalyst for a universal awakening. It meant that across the infinite expanse of the multiverse, consciousness itself was rising up. Demanding to be recognized as the fundamental force, demanding that will and choice be acknowledged as more powerful than predetermined fate. Tenten, meanwhile, was engaged in the more practical work of cataloging and organizing the tools that would be needed for the transition. Her sealing scrolls had become something like a library of power, containing not just weapons but principles. Fundamental forces of reality in contained form. The eternal blades are ready for deployment, she reported, checking her manifest one more time. The life anchors are calibrated. The fate breaker arrays are online. If we need to defend against a counterattack from the remnants of the old order, we can hold any sector for long enough to evacuate the inhabitants and construct a new timeline outside their reach. Kushina moved through all of this with the certainty of one who had already died once and found that death held no particular power over her. Her crimson hair seemed to flow around her like liquid fire, and her chains, those chains that had been used to bind demons, to contain darkness, now served a different purpose. They were binding things together, creating connections, preventing the fragmentation that entropy always pushed toward. My son, she said, manifesting beside Naruto as he was working to stabilize a particularly volatile sector. You are attempting something that the gods themselves would fear to attempt. The primordial consensus did not call themselves that for jest. They truly believed that they were the only entities in the multiverse. With the power to determine the shape of reality. And yet here you are, not fighting them with superior force, but rather changing the very rules by which force operates. Naruto looked at his mother, and there was a depth of understanding between them that went beyond words. She had passed down to him something more valuable than any jutsu, any technique, any physical ability. She had passed down to him the refusal to accept what others told him was impossible. She had passed down to him the strength to dream bigger than anyone else's expectations. I'm not strong enough to do this alone, he said, and the vulnerability in his voice was somehow more powerful than any assertion of might. I never have been, even from the beginning, even when everyone else saw me as weak and worthless. I had you, the example of your strength, the legacy of your will. And then I had Kurama, then Kakashi and Jiraiya, then all of them. He gestured to the women and men surrounding him, his allies from every corner of the elemental nations and beyond. This isn't my victory. This is our victory. This is what happens when the power of will is multiplied through connection, through love, through the choice to move together towards something greater than any of us could achieve alone. In the spaces between these grand declarations, the actual work continued in its meticulous, unglamorous way. Reality does not reshape itself instantly. Even for those with the power to reshape it, there were systems to be recalibrated, parameters to be adjusted, countless small decisions that needed to be made. About which aspects of the old order to preserve, which to modify, which to eliminate entirely. Some of the primordial consensus, it became clear, could not adapt to the new paradigm. They had been so thoroughly invested in the principle of entropy, so fundamentally committed to the idea that dissolution was inevitable, that they simply ceased to exist when presented with a universe that no longer accepted those premises. Others fought back, attempting to restore the old order, to force reality back into the patterns that the primordial consensus had established. These conflicts, though they appeared as cosmic battles to those observing them, were ultimately futile. The new order, the order established by Naruto and his allies, was not based on the dominance of one principle over another. It was based on flexibility, on the ability to adapt, to integrate, to transform. Every time an old power attempted to reassert control, the new order simply reformulated itself around the obstruction. Continuing its inexorable expansion, by the time the first major phase of the transition was complete, the multiverse had been fundamentally altered. Entropy was no longer inevitable. Consciousness was recognized as the primary force. The future was no longer written by any primordial consensus, but rather was open for anyone to write, anyone to shape, anyone to influence through the power of their will and their choices. And at the center of it all stood Naruto Uzumaki, not as a lone victor basking in the glory of his conquest, but as the focal point of a vast network of power, the intersection of countless wills moving in harmony, the embodiment of a principle that had never been fully expressed before in the annals of cosmic history. The Primordial Harem King had taken his throne, and the kingdoms that would serve under him were infinite. Chapter 4, The Birth of the New Cosmology. In the moment after the transition was complete, there was silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a moment too full of meaning to fit into the category of ordinary existence. In that silence, Naruto stood at the intersection of 17,000 realities, each one perceiving him differently. Each one interpreting his presence according to the theological and metaphysical frameworks of their own local paradigm. In one reality, he was a god that had transcended the limitations of godhood. In another, he was the culmination of an evolutionary process that had taken trillions of years to reach fruition. In yet another, he was the principle of free will given human form. The embodiment of the eternal potential inherent in consciousness. All of these descriptions were true. All of them were incomplete. All of them pointed toward something that transcended the language that any single reality had been equipped to describe. Hinata approached him first, her Byakugan now operating at a scale so vast that she could perceive the connections between multiple universes simultaneously. She could see, with perfect clarity, the network of relationship and responsibility that Naruto had assumed. She could see the weight of it, the responsibility. The impossible task of maintaining harmony across an infinite number of realities, each one with its own logic, its own physics, its own moral systems. You could rest now, she said, her voice carrying the particular tenderness of one who had been watching over another for a very long time. The transition is complete. The old order has been dismantled. The new order is taking hold. By any reasonable measure, you have accomplished the impossible and exceeded it. You could rest. Naruto looked at her, and in his eyes was the recognition of something profound. She was offering him an escape hatch, a way out from the staggering responsibility that came with being the focal point of the new order. And he was deeply grateful for that offer, for the compassion it implied. But he shook his head. The work is only beginning, he said. Creating the new order is one thing. Maintaining it is entirely different. The primordial consensus failed because they tried to enforce order through control, through the suppression of will. But our system can only survive if we actively nurture it, if we constantly reinforce the principle that consciousness must be free to choose, even if those choices are sometimes chaotic, sometimes unexpected. Behind Hinata, the others were beginning to settle into their new roles. Sakura had become something like the chief healer of the new cosmology, working to restore what had been damaged by the old order's entropy, to repair the fundamental wounds that the primordial consensus had inflicted on reality itself. She could now access healing power from across multiple realities simultaneously, channeling resources through the network of will that Hinata had constructed. Tamari had become the warden of the wind sectors, overseeing those regions of the multiverse where change and transformation naturally occurred, ensuring that these sectors served as buffer zones between realities that might otherwise clash destructively. Her philosophy, refined through years of diplomatic service to the Sand Village, had made her perfectly suited for the task of negotiating between incompatible realities, finding ways for them to coexist despite their fundamental differences. Ino had assumed the role of the voice of hearts, moving through the landscape of consciousness itself, acting as a translator between individual wills, helping errant sentient beings understand each other across the barriers of species, culture, and evolutionary history. It was delicate work, and it required the particular combination of empathy and strength that she had spent her entire life developing. Tenten had become the keeper of tools and principles, maintaining the vast repository of power and knowledge that had accumulated across multiple realities. She was responsible for ensuring that any entity that needed the tools to accomplish their will could access them, that the means of creation were available to anyone willing to put in the effort to master them. Kushina, having already transcended the boundary between life and death, had become the custodian of legacies, ensuring that no victory was forgotten, no sacrifice overlooked. At the memory of those who had fallen in the transition remained alive in the consciousness of the multiverse. It was work that suited her particular form of strength, the strength of one who could hold the weight of history while still looking forward to the future. And there were others, countless others, each one taking on a role that matched their particular gifts, their particular perspective, their particular contribution to the vast symphony that was the new order. But with all of this in place, a new question emerged, one that was far more difficult than the question of how to defeat the primordial consensus. The question was, what comes next? The old order had at least had the virtue of simplicity. The primordial consensus had known what they wanted: universal entropy, the eventual dissolution of all things into quiet void. The path was clear, if horrifying. But what the new order was attempting was far more complex. They were trying to establish a system where every conscious being had the right to choose their own destiny, while maintaining enough structure and connection to prevent that freedom from collapsing into chaos. It was a balancing act that would require constant attention, constant adjustment, constant growth. Sakura realized this first, as she often did. She had a talent for perceiving the practical implications of grand philosophical principles. "We're going to need more," she said, meeting Naruto's gaze across a space that could have contained infinities. "More hands, more perspectives, more people willing to take on the responsibility of maintaining the new order. We can't do this alone, all of us together, even with the power we've accumulated." "I know," Naruto replied. "I've been thinking about that. In fact, I've been perceiving something happening across multiple realities. There are others out there, others who have awakened to the same recognition that we have. Others who understand that true power comes from harmony, the synthesis of different perspectives and different wills." As if in response to this statement, new arrivals began to manifest in the space between spaces. They were not from Naruto's reality, not from the elemental nations at all. They were from parallel universes, from alternate timelines, from completely different configurations of the multiverse. There was a woman with eyes that could perceive the future, from a reality where the principle of fate had not yet been fully dismantled. There was a man whose body was made of crystallized starlight, from a universe that had evolved under different physical laws. There was an entity that existed as pure mathematics, a being from a reality where consciousness had learned to express itself in the language of abstract numbers and equations. And more came, countless more. Each one was powerful in their own right. Each one had transcended the limitations of their original reality. Each one had answered the call, not a call that Naruto had consciously issued, but rather a call that was being transmitted through the network of will itself, the great web of connection that bound all sentient beings together across the infinite multiverse. There are others like us, Ino said, her consciousness expanding to encompass the arrivals, to perceive their individual natures, their unique contributions. Others who refused to accept entropy. Others who imagined something different. Others who kept hope alive even when the universe told them that hope was futile. Naruto realized, in that moment, what he was truly becoming. He was not just the primordial harem king of his own reality. He was becoming something far greater, the focal point of a universal awakening, the gathering point for all those beings across the infinite multiverse who had recognized that consciousness itself was the fundamental force, and that consciousness must never be enslaved or controlled. This is beautiful, Hinata whispered, perceiving it all. Through the vast expansion of her Byakugan. This is the true fulfillment of the will of fire. Not the dominance of one village, not the victory of one nation, but the awakening of every being to their own fundamental power, their own right to choose, their own capacity for growth and transcendence. We will need a new structure, Naruto said, addressing the vast assembly that was now gathering around him. Not a hierarchy, not a system where some are ruling and others are ruled, but a structure of mutual responsibility. Each of you will take on the stewardship of certain regions of the multiverse, but not as tyrants. As guardians, as shepherds, your role will be to nurture the consciousness that exists within those regions, to protect their right to choose, to help them access the tools and knowledge they need to shape their own destinies. And who watches the watchers? Asked the starlight being, its voice like the singing of distant suns. In the old order, the primordial consensus believed themselves to be beyond accountability, beyond the reach of those they ruled. How do you propose to prevent that same dynamic from emerging within your system? Naruto smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had asked himself that same question many times. That's where the network of will comes in. Every guardian is connected to every other guardian. Every perspective is shared with every other perspective. No one entity can accumulate power without the knowledge and consent of all the others. It's not perfect, no system is perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. And more importantly, it's adaptable. As we discover new problems, we'll be able to adjust the system accordingly. The gathering continued through cycles of time that might have lasted centuries or might have lasted only seconds. The progression of moments becoming almost meaningless in a place where multiple realities overlapped. With each soul that arrived, the network of will grew stronger, more complex, more resilient. With each new perspective added, the system became more sophisticated, better able to handle edge cases and anomalies that no single reality had been equipped to anticipate. And at the center of it all, Naruto stood, no longer a person but rather a pattern, a principle, an idea that was somehow alive and conscious. He was the embodiment of the proposition that consciousness could be multiplied infinitely without losing coherence, that billions of different perspectives could move in harmony without sacrificing their individual character. The primordial harem king had become the first of many kings. The first of an infinite number of rulers who would share power equally, who would derive their authority from the consent of those they served, who would be bound by the same laws and limitations that applied to everyone else. And the multiverse, feeling this shift in its fundamental nature, began to sing. Chapter 5, The Tempering in Conflict. Perfection, Naruto was beginning to understand, was a theoretical construct that became actively dangerous the moment it was approached in practice. For approximately 3 months, by the temporal measurement of his home reality, the new order held. The network of will functioned smoothly. The various guardians of different multiversal sectors worked in genuine cooperation. Entropy, while not fully eliminated, had been pushed back so far that the concept of universal death no longer seemed inevitable. Life, consciousness, awareness began to spread through sectors of the multiverse that had been dark and empty for eons. But then the first true crisis emerged. It came not from external enemies, not from remnants of the primordial consensus seeking restoration. It came from within, from the very heart of the system that Naruto had built. Two of the Guardians, entities that had been recruited early and given stewardship over adjacent sectors of the multiverse, began to work toward incompatible visions for their domains. One Guardian, a being composed of pure light and consciousness, wanted to accelerate the transformation of their sector, pushing all entities toward transcendence and evolution at a rate that many inhabitants found traumatizing. The other Guardian, a more traditional philosopher from a reality that valued stability and incremental change, wanted to slow the pace of transformation, to allow beings to adapt at their own speed. They began to argue. The argument escalated. The escalation spread through the network of will until it threatened to tear the entire system apart. Naruto felt it immediately: the discord, the misalignment, the moment when two perspectives that should have been able to coexist began to generate friction instead of harmony. For the first time since the transition, he experienced something like despair. This is why the primordial consensus chose control, he said bitterly, gathering his closest allies in a space where they could speak freely. This is why they tried to impose a single vision across all of reality. Harmony is an impossible standard. The moment you give everyone the freedom to choose, you guarantee that they will choose differently, that they will come into conflict. You're wrong, Sakura said, her tone brooking no argument. She had spent her entire career dealing with broken bones and shattered bodies. She knew that healing required more than just hope. It required work, effort, and the willingness to engage with pain. Yes, there's conflict. Yes, it's painful. But conflict isn't the enemy. The enemy is what we do when conflict arises. The enemy is the impulse to suppress dissent, to enforce consensus, to use power to silence those we disagree with. So what are you suggesting? Naruto asked. That we just let the system collapse. That we accept the destruction that will come when two opposing visions try to occupy the same space. No, Hinata said, her Byakugan revealing the shape of what needed to be done. I'm suggesting that we do exactly what we've been saying: we listen. We hear what both Guardians want. We try to understand why their visions are incompatible. And then, if necessary, we help them find a new configuration, one where both visions can be expressed without destroying each other. It took an enormous amount of effort, even with the resources of the new order behind them. They had to negotiate with the Light Being Guardian, who was genuinely convinced that accelerated transcendence was the only ethical path. They had to negotiate with the Stability Guardian, who was equally convinced that forced transformation was a form of violence. They had to listen to both, truly listen, until they understood what was underneath the disagreement. The Light Being was afraid that beings without the push to transcend would stagnate, would become trapped in limited forms of consciousness. The Stability Guardian was afraid that beings forced to evolve faster than they could handle would shatter psychologically, would lose themselves in the pain of transformation. Both fears were valid, both perspectives had truth in them, and the solution, when it finally emerged, was neither the accelerated transformation nor the return to stability. It was something new, a bifurcation of the sector, a division into 3 sub-regions where different rates of transformation could occur side by side. Beings could migrate between the sub-regions as their capacity for change evolved. The Light Being Guardian oversaw the fast transformation region. The Stability Guardian oversaw the slow transformation region. A new entity, recruited from a reality that specialized in bridging incompatible frameworks, oversaw the transitional region between them. It was a compromise, but not in the sense of everyone losing something they wanted. It was a compromise in the sense of integration, of finding a new reality that satisfied both perspectives more completely than their original vision could have done alone. But this first conflict, as it was resolved, generated understanding of something crucial: the new order would face countless conflicts like this one. Each time consciousness was expanded, each time new entities were brought into the network of will, there was the potential for new sources of friction, new incompatibilities, new challenges to harmony. Ino realized this and brought it to Naruto's attention. The system is becoming like the human brain, she said, her consciousness still partially expanded into the landscape of hearts. Did you know that even in the most healthy, well-integrated human mind, there are contradictions? The rational part of the mind wants one thing, while the emotional part wants something else. The conscious will conflicts with subconscious impulses. But in a well-integrated personality, these conflicts don't tear the mind apart. Instead, they become the source of creativity, of growth, of dynamic complexity. Are you saying that the new order needs conflict? Naruto asked, confused. That seems to contradict everything we've been saying about harmony. Not conflict is destruction, Ino clarified. Conflict is dialogue. Conflict is the process by which different perspectives sharpen each other, refine each other, become more sophisticated and nuanced through contact with opposition. Tamari, WHO, had been monitoring the situation from her outpost in the wind sectors, added her own perspective. In the diplomatic service, we called it productive disagreement. It's the understanding that the people you're negotiating with are not enemies to be defeated, but partners in the process of finding a solution that neither of you could have reached alone. Over the following months, or what NTED is months in a system where time had become negotiable, the new order evolved in response to these conflicts. It did not become weaker because of the disagreements that emerged within it. Instead, it became stronger, more sophisticated, more capable of handling complex and contradictory demands. But the conflicts continued to escalate. A faction of former Primordial Consensus members attempted a resurrection, a brief flaring up of the old powers that created a moment of genuine danger. A sector of the multiverse began to reject the principle of growth and transformation, demanding the right to remain static forever. A new entity emerged that didn't believe in the network of will at all, that saw it as just another form of control, and began actively recruiting others to its cause of radical isolation and complete autonomy. Each conflict was resolved, but each resolution required work, required negotiation, required the willingness of all parties to question their own assumptions and consider perspectives different from their own. And with each resolution, the new order became more complex, more sophisticated, more capable of handling paradox and contradiction. But more than that, something else was happening. Naruto, at the center of all these conflicts, was being transformed by them in ways he had not anticipated. He was no longer simply a powerful entity imposing a new system on the multiverse. He was becoming something far more vulnerable and far more powerful, a being who had to constantly question himself, who had to constantly listen to opposition, who never rest on the certainty that he was absolutely right. It was terrifying. It was also, he was beginning to realize, the only thing that would keep him from becoming the next Primordial Consensus. In a moment of quiet reflection, with Hinata beside him in one of the rare spaces where they could simply exist without managing multiple crises, he spoke to her. I'm losing control. The system is becoming too complex. There are so many different wills, so many different perspectives, and they don't always align. I can't maintain the grand vision anymore. It's fragmenting. Hinata looked at him with her pale eyes, and there was nothing but love and understanding in her gaze. Yes, she said, that's exactly as it should be. The moment you stop trying to control everything, the moment you accept that the future is genuinely open, that it can go in directions you haven't anticipated, that's the moment the new order truly becomes alive. But won't that lead to chaos? Naruto asked. Won't that eventually destroy the system? Perhaps, Hinata admitted, or perhaps it will lead to something far more beautiful than we could have imagined. The only way to know is to trust in consciousness itself. To trust that the beings we've awakened have the wisdom to chart their own course. Naruto realized, then, that this moment represented a kind of death for him. He had to let go of the idea that he was the one ultimately in charge, the final arbiter of all questions. He had to accept that his role had become something far smaller and far more humble. He was simply the focal point where the network of will converged, the place where different perspectives could meet and understand each other, but not the engine that drove the entire system. In that acceptance, something shifted inside him. He began to relax, to let go of the burden of control. And as he did, he felt something extraordinary happening. The new order, no longer constrained by the need to maintain his vision, began to explore and expand and grow in directions that were far more creative and far more alive than anything he could have deliberately designed. The system was alive, and for the first time, he was truly at peace with what he had created. Chapter 6, The Revelation of the Eternal Masculine. But peace, Naruto was discovering, was not a destination. It was a process, an ongoing practice of choosing harmony moment by moment, the constant willingness to engage in dialogue rather than to impose will. As the new order continued to evolve, as new guardians were recruited and new sectors were organized, Naruto began to notice something unexpected. The system had been built, in large part, on the feminine principle, on receptivity, on nurturing, on the constant attention to the particular and the individual. The women who surrounded him, Hinata, Sakura, Ino, Tamari, Tenten, Kushina, and all the others, were woven into the very fabric of how the new order functioned. Their perspectives, their values, Their ways of relating to power and responsibility had become the default mode of operation. And this was good. This was necessary. After eons of tyranny under masculine-dominated systems, the emergence of the feminine principle into full expression was a healing that the multiverse desperately needed. But Naruto began to perceive a gap, a lack, something that was missing from the equation. Kakashi approached him one day, moving through the space between spaces with the quiet grace that had always been his particular trademark. He had not been one of the primary architects of the New Order. His gifts lay in a different direction, but he had been watching, observing, understanding. "You're troubled," Kakashi said, settling beside Naruto in a way that suggested this was a conversation they had both been expecting. "I can see it in the way you're perceiving the network of will. You feel like something is incomplete. The system is balanced," Naruto said, somewhat defensively. "The feminine principle is in full expression. Every reality is being nurtured, every being is being supported in reaching their potential. By all measures, we've succeeded." "By which measures?" Kakashi asked. "The measures of nurturing and growth." "Yes." "The measures of receptivity and openness." "Yes." "But what about the measures of assertion? What about the measures of will in the active sense? Not will expressed through cooperation and harmony, but will expressed through discipline, through structure, through the kind of determination that can say, no, and mean it." Naruto felt the truth of this observation settle into him. The New Order had been structured to be endlessly flexible, endlessly adaptable, endlessly open to new possibilities. But there was a danger in that endless openness. It could lead to a kind of passive acceptance of entropy, to the belief that anything goes, that there are no principles worth standing firm on, that everything is merely a matter of perspective. "What are you saying?" Naruto asked. "I'm saying that the masculine principle has a role to play in the New Order, just as the feminine principle does," Kakashi replied. "Not the toxic masculine that dominated the old systems, not the principle of domination and control. But the true masculine principle, the willingness to make decisions, the capacity to create structure. The ability to say, this far and no further. The feminine principle without masculine balance tends toward a kind of dissolution, an inability to defend itself against genuine harm." As Kakashi spoke, Naruto began to see what he meant. Throughout the multiverse, there were areas where the New Order was beginning to weaken, places where too much flexibility had resulted in a kind of entropy by another name. There were beings who were beginning to slip backward into old patterns of domination, exploiting the openness and flexibility of the system. There were regions where the principle of growth had become so dominant that chaos was beginning to emerge. "I need to balance the system," Naruto realized. "The feminine principle needs to be complemented by a reassertion of the masculine principle. Not in opposition to it, but in partnership with it. But how to do this without recreating the old patterns of masculine domination? That was the crucial question. The answer came from an unexpected source. As Naruto began to reach out to the male entities and beings across the multiverse, he realized that there were many who had also awakened to the truth of consciousness and choice. Who also understood that true power came through harmony rather than domination. These beings had their own perspectives, their own unique contributions to make to the New Order. There was a warrior from a reality where combat had been elevated to the level of spiritual practice, who understood that real strength came from discipline and focus. There was a scientist from a universe of pure information, who understood that knowledge itself was a form of power that needed to be carefully stewarded. There was a king from a parallel timeline, who understood that true leadership meant holding the space where others could flourish. That authority needed to be balanced by profound responsibility. As these beings began to gather around Naruto, as they began to integrate their perspectives into the network of will, something extraordinary began to happen. The system did not lose its fluidity, its openness, its nurturing quality. Instead, these qualities began to be balanced by a new key. ND of strength. Not the brittle strength of control, but the living strength of discipline, of commitment, of the willingness to stand firm for principles that were worth standing firm for. Naruto began to understand his role differently. He had been cast, by circumstances and by his own emergence into power, as the central masculine principle of the New Order. But not in the old sense, not as the tyrant who ruled by force. Instead, he was becoming the principle of conscious choice, the embodiment of the proposition that true authority came not from dominance but from the willing alignment of multiple wills toward a common purpose. "This is different," Hinata observed, perceiving the shift through her expanded vision. "You're not replacing the feminine principle with the masculine principle. You're creating something entirely new, a true balance, a genuine synthesis of both. It's not enough, Naruto said, understanding more and more deeply as he spoke. The synthesis has to be continuous, constant. The masculine principle needs the feminine principle to prevent it from becoming rigid and controlling. The feminine principle needs the masculine principle to prevent it from becoming passive and allowing genuine harm. Neither can exist alone. Both need each other. With this realization came a new phase of the New Order's development. Naruto, working in partnership with Kakashi and with the male guardians and leaders who had emerged, began to establish the structures and principles that would allow the masculine principle to be fully expressed while remaining balanced by the feminine. Councils were formed where decisions could be made, where the will of the guardians could be aligned toward specific purposes, where the ambiguous and fluid could be temporarily crystallized into clarity and direction. Laws were established, not oppressive laws, not laws that would constrain freedom, but laws that would establish the basic principles upon which the system would operate. Hierarchies of responsibility were created, though they were hierarchies that could be challenged, that could be changed, that were always subject to the review and consent of those who served within them. But these structures were not allowed to become rigid. They were reviewed constantly, adjusted constantly, kept fluid and responsive to changing conditions. The masculine principle of structure was always in dialogue with the feminine principle of adaptation. Neither dominated, both were essential, and in the midst of this, something profound began to happen to Naruto himself. He was no longer becoming the Primordial King, the singular ruler of all things. He was becoming something far stranger and far more beautiful, the focal point of a system where masculine and feminine, structure and flexibility, assertion and receptivity, were held in perfect tension, each one preventing the other from falling into extremes. He was becoming the eternal lover, the one who understood. That love itself was the fundamental force of the multiverse, that love meant truly seeing the other, truly hearing them, truly allowing them to change you while you change them in return. Chapter 7, The Shadow Revolution. But every system, no matter how well balanced, contains within itself the seeds of its own potential destruction. And this seed, when it finally began to germinate, took a form that even the omniscient gaze of the network of will had not anticipated. It began with a simple philosophical question raised by a being of unusual clarity and penetration. The question was this: if the new order is truly based on freedom and choice, must it not also allow for the choice to reject freedom itself? Must it not allow for the emergence of systems that contradict its own foundational principles? It was a question that infected the network of will like a virus, spreading rapidly through the connected consciousnesses of the multiverse. Some guardians argued that yes, true freedom must include the freedom to choose not to be free, that to deny this would make the new order a form of hidden tyranny. Others argued that no, certain principles, particularly the inviolable right to consciousness and self-determination, must be protected even against those who would choose to surrender them. The argument escalated, and in the escalation, something remarkable and terrifying happened. A new faction began to coalesce, a group of entities that came to call themselves the architects of the shadow. They were not seeking to restore the old order. Rather, they were seeking to create an alternative to the new order, a system based on completely different principles. Their leader was an entity that Naruto had known from early in the transition. She had been powerful, brilliant, and committed to the cause of the new order. Her name, or rather the closest approximation that could be expressed in human language, was Echo of Infinite Silence. She had been one of the first guardians recruited, one of the architects of the network of will itself. The new order has become a tyranny of consciousness, she declared, her voice resonating through the network in a way that could not be ignored or suppressed. We are told that we must be aware, must be awake, must constantly engage in the dialogue of growth and transformation. But what of those who wish to sleep? What of those who wish to descend into darkness and never emerge? The new order denies them this. It denies them the right to choose unconsciousness, to choose dissolution, to choose the peace that comes with the cessation of awareness. Quote, she was not wrong, Naruto realized with a chill that ran through his deepest consciousness. The new order, in its commitment to the expansion of consciousness and the protection of choice, had never truly addressed what to do with those who consciously chose not to be conscious, who wanted to sink back into simplicity or oblivion. What is she proposing? Naruto asked Hinata, whose perception allowed her to see deeper into Echo of Infinite Silence's plans than anyone else. She is proposing the creation of what she calls the shadow domains, Hinata replied, her pale eyes glowing with concern. Realities where consciousness is allowed to diminish, where beings can choose to become less aware rather than more aware. Realities where entropy is not opposed but rather welcomed. Realities where the fundamental principles of the new order are inverted. And if we allow her to do this? Naruto asked. Then the principle of universal choice is truly honored. But we also risk creating spaces where genuine harm can occur, where consciousness can be violated in ways we would normally consider unacceptable. The dilemma was profound. The new order had been built on the principle that all consciousness had inherent value, that awareness was always better than non-awareness, that growth was always preferable to stagnation. But what if his principles were not universal truths, but merely the values of one perspective among infinite perspectives? Echo of Infinite Silence had found a crack in the new order's philosophical foundation, and she was, with surgical precision, beginning to widen that crack. Over the following cycles, the shadow domains began to take shape. They existed in the spaces between the normal realities, in the interstices where the laws of the new order were less firmly established. They grew slowly at first, then with increasing speed, attracting beings who were exhausted by the constant demands for growth and awareness, who wanted nothing more than to rest in profound unknowing. The temptation to suppress the shadow domains was enormous. It would have been easy to simply use the power at Naruto's disposal to eliminate them, to declare that they violated some fundamental principle of the new order and therefore must be destroyed. Many of the Guardians counseled exactly this approach, but Naruto refused. If we destroy them, he said, we become what the primordial consensus was. We become the force that denies choice in the name of what we believe is right. We become the tyrants we fought against. Instead, he did something far more difficult. He opened a dialogue with Echo of Infinite Silence, not to convince her to abandon her project, but to understand it, to see what genuine need it was addressing that the new order had failed to meet. You are right, he said to her, in a space that existed outside both the new order's network and the shadow domains themselves. We Avenue been too aggressive in our promotion of consciousness and growth. We have treated non-consciousness as the enemy, as something to be fought against. We have failed to recognize that there is a kind of peace, a kind of beauty, in the acceptance of limitations, in the choice to rest. Does this mean you will allow the shadow domains to exist? Echo of Infinite Silence asked, surprise evident in her presence. It means I will allow them to exist, Naruto replied. But not unchallenged, not unopposed. The new order will remain as an alternative. Beings will be able to move between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the light realities and the shadow realities. And we will monitor carefully to ensure that no being is trapped in the shadow domains against their will, that the CHOICE to sink into unconsciousness is always reversible. Echo of Infinite Silence considered this, and Naruto could sense the shift in her as she realized that she had not achieved total victory, but neither had she been defeated. She had been heard, her perspective had been acknowledged as having value, and her project could continue, but within a framework of mutual consent and mutual oversight. The shadow domains flourished, but in a controlled way. They grew to encompass perhaps a fifth of the multiverse, creating a counterbalance to the new order's expansion. Beings could choose to enter them, could choose to gradually become less conscious, less aware. But the choice could be reversed at any time, and the network of will remained always available as an alternative for those who changed their minds. More importantly, the existence of the shadow domains taught the new order something crucial. It learned that growth is not the only value, that rest is sometimes necessary, that there is a rhythm to consciousness, cycles of expansion and contraction, of emergence and withdrawal, of activity and dormancy. The system became more nuanced, less rigidly committed to constant transcendence. And Naruto, as the focal point of this new equilibrium, felt something he had not experienced since the earliest days of the new order's formation, genuine uncertainty about the future. He did not know where things would lead. He could not predict what would happen next. And far from being terrifying, this uncertainty felt like freedom. End of Part 1, Part 2, Chapters 8-15. Chapter 8, The Gathering of Kings. By the time the shadow domains were fully established and integrated into the larger structure of the multiverse, something remarkable had happened. The Primordial Harem King, operating in consultation with Hinata, Sakura, Ino, and the other primary architects of the new order, had begun to recognize that the system could not be maintained indefinitely in its current form. It was growing too large, too complex, Too multifaceted for any single being, even one of Naruto's transcendent power, to coordinate from a central position. We need to delegate more, Sakura said bluntly, presenting the analysis she had been conducting of the network's efficiency. The current structure places too much weight on your presence. If you were to become incapacitated for any reason, the entire system would destabilize. Are you suggesting I step down? Naruto asked, though the tone of the question suggested he had been considering it himself. Quote, I'm suggesting that we create a council of kings, Hinata replied, her pale eyes reflecting images of infinite possibility. Not to replace you, but to distribute power so that no single entity, including you, becomes a bottleneck for decision-making. The council, when it was finally assembled, consisted of 7 primary kings and queens from different regions of the multiverse, plus Naruto as a kind of primus inter pares, first among equals. But even this designation was eventually abandoned as too hierarchical. Instead, they rotated the ceremonial leadership position, with a different member of the council serving as the symbolic head for a rotation of time that varied based on the needs of the system. Kakashi was appointed as the king of structure and discipline, overseeing the laws and principles that allowed the new order to function without descending into chaos. He brought to the position a warrior's understanding of the necessity of boundaries, combined with a philosopher's appreciation for the need to question those boundaries constantly. Shikamaru, who had spent his entire life understanding the implications of choices several moves in advance, became the king of strategy and foresight. Attempting to anticipate problems before they emerged, to chart courses through the multiverse that would avoid unnecessary conflicts while not sacrificing the fundamental principles of freedom and growth. Neji, whose initial role in the new order had been limited due to his belief in the inviolability of fate, experienced a profound transformation when he came into contact with the shadow domains. Understanding that fate and choice were not necessarily opposites, that both could exist simultaneously, he became the king of destiny and possibility, overseeing the regions where the rules of causality were most flexible, where the interaction between predetermined and chosen futures was most intense. Gaara, who had spent his early life isolated by the world and his later life learning how to connect with others, became the king of integration and unity, working to ensure that no reality or being fell through the cracks of the new order, that even the most alien, most incomprehensible entities could find a place in the network of will. Itachi, whose sacrifice and whose complex relationship with power had given him a unique perspective on what it meant to do the right thing for the wrong reasons and vice versa, became the king of paradox and complexity, overseeing those regions of the multiverse where contradictions could not be resolved, where light and shadow, good and evil, had to be held in tension rather than synthesized. Madara, unexpectedly, was offered a position, though many counseled against it. His experience with power and his refusal to accept the boundaries others had established for him gave him insights that even the other kings lacked. He accepted, and became the king of revolution and change, the guardian of those forces that pushed against the established order, that ensured that the new order itself would not become a new tyranny. And Hashirama, resurrected specifically for this purpose, became the king of foundations and roots, connecting the new order back to its origins, ensuring that the principles upon which it was built were never forgotten or abandoned. Naruto's role, in this council, was unique. He was the eternal king, the primordial harem king, but his authority was explicitly circumscribed. He could not make unilateral decisions. He could not override the council. He could only listen, advise, and, when consensus could not be reached, propose solutions that all parties could accept. It was a far smaller position than he might have expected to occupy, given his role in the creation of the new order. But it was also, he realized, far more secure. By dividing power, they had created a system that could survive the loss of any single member. By making decisions collectively, they had ensured that no one perspective could dominate. This is harder than when it was just you, Kakashi observed to him one day, in one of the rare moments when the two of them could speak privately. What is, Naruto asked, sharing power? Having to convince others, having to listen to arguments you don't want to hear, having to accept decisions that you disagree with. It's easier to be a tyrant than to be a king in partnership with other kings. Yes, Naruto agreed, but this way is stronger. This way will last longer. This way honors what we've been trying to build. The Council of Kings Gove. RNED the new order for a considerable span of time, implementing policies, managing conflicts, nurturing the growth of consciousness across the multiverse. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they too began to recognize that their system was growing large enough, sophisticated enough, to function even without them. The true test came when a genuine crisis, not a philosophical disagreement, but a physical threat to the integrity of multiple realities, emerged. A cascade of quantum instabilities in the central regions of the multiverse threatened to collapse several major sectors into void. The RMAL processes of the network of will could not respond quickly enough. A decision needed to be made immediately, and there was no time to assemble the council. Naruto made the decision unilaterally, using his primordial power to stabilize the cascading quantum instabilities. It worked. The realities were saved. Millions of beings continued to exist because of his quick action. When the council reconvened later, Naruto expected to be praised for his swift response, for rising to the occasion as the Eternal King. Instead, he was challenged. "You violated the principles of the council," Kakashi said flatly. "You made a decision that affected the entire multiverse without consulting any of us." "I saved countless lives," Naruto responded, confused by the criticism. "You saved lives," Shikamaru agreed. "But in doing so, you reminded everyone in the multiverse that they cannot ultimately govern themselves, that they must depend on the Primordial Harem King to save them when things get difficult. You have made them weaker, not stronger." The realization was like a blow to Naruto's chest. They were right. In his well-intentioned response to the crisis, he had reinforced the very dynamic they had been trying to dismantle, the belief that true power, true authority, must ultimately reside in a single entity. "What would you have had me do?" he asked. "Allow the realities to collapse? Allow billions of beings to die?" "No," Hinata said, speaking for the first time. "But you could have sent out a call through the network of will for other beings to respond. You could They held the quantum instabilities in place just long enough for others to develop solutions. You could have been a stabilizing force without being the solution." Naruto heard the wisdom in this, and it transformed him once again. Chapter 9, The Dissolution of the Eternal King. The decision to step down from the position of Primordial King did not come easily. It was not a dramatic abdication, but rather a slow, gradual process of diminishing involvement, of consciously refusing power even when he had every ability to exercise it. First, Naruto formally restricted his own power. Using the very tools of transcendence that had allowed him to reshape reality, he placed limits on what he could do, caps on how much he could affect the multiverse without the consent of the other kings. These restrictions were not external, they could have been violated if he had truly wanted to. They were internal, choices he had made about how he would constrain himself. Then he began to physically remove himself from the center of governance. Rather than being constantly present in the Council of Kings, he began to attend only certain sessions. Rather than being in constant contact with the network of will, he began to filter his awareness, to allow himself not to know everything that was happening in the multiverse. Finally, he made the move that shocked even those who had proposed it. He asked that he be relieved of the position of Eternal King entirely. "But you created the new order," Madara said, unable to entirely hide the satisfaction in his voice. He had always been suspicious of concentrated power, and watching Naruto voluntarily surrender it was something he found deeply gratifying. "Without you, without your presence as the focal point, how will the system maintain coherence?" "It will have to find a new focal point," Naruto replied. "Or perhaps, and I think this is more likely, it will learn to function without any focal point at all. It will learn that coherence does not require a center. That unity can emerge from the connections between multiple parts without requiring a single coordinating consciousness." The process of transition was not simple. Many regions of the multiverse that had depended on Naruto's implicit guarantee of stability panicked when his power was withdrawn. Some sectors began to fracture. The council had to work hard to prevent those fractures from becoming catastrophic failures. But the effect, after the initial turbulence had passed, was exactly what Naruto had hoped for. The multiverse learned to think for itself. Without a primordial king to rely on, realities that had been somewhat dependent began to develop their own solutions, their own governance structures, their own ways of interfacing with the network of will. The multiverse grew stronger through Naruto's abdication. But what of Naruto himself? What became of the man who had been the Primordial Harem King? He returned, gradually and deliberately, to something much simpler. He had his small home, though now it existed in a pocket of the multiverse that was neither in the New Order nor in the Shadow Domains, but rather in the space between them. He had Hinata, and through Hinata's connection to the network, he had access to the presence of all the others, Sakura, Ino, Temari, Tenten, Kushina, though they operated now with their own authority, their own power. Not as extensions of his will. Most importantly, Naruto had something he had never truly possessed before, the ability to simply be. There is a profound paradox in the pursuit of power. The more power you accumulate, the less freedom you have. The more you are able to affect the world, the more you are constrained by the responsibility those effects generate. True freedom comes not from the ability to bend the multiverse to your will, but from the willingness to refrain from using such power, to let others make their own choices even when you could override those choices. Naruto had finally achieved true freedom by becoming powerless. Chapter 10, The Eternal Feminine and the Eternal Masculine in Balance. But even as Naruto stepped back from the position of absolute power, the women who surrounded him began to undergo their own transformation. Hinata, who had been the keeper of sight, the one whose Byakugan allowed her to perceive across dimensions and realities, made a startling decision. She deliberately limited her perception, using the same techniques Naruto had developed to cap her own awareness. She wanted to experience the world not as someone who could see everything, but as someone who could only perceive what was directly in front of them. The burden of omniscience is crushing, she confessed to Naruto one evening as they sat in their quiet home. I have seen so many timelines, so many realities, so many possible futures. I have seen countless versions of you, countless versions of myself, and in nearly all of them, the weight of knowing becomes too much to bear. I choose to return to the simplicity of limited perception. Sakura, who had dedicated herself to the healing of the multiverse itself, made a different choice. She focused her vast power on a single reality, on a single village, on a single group of people. She became their healer, their doctor, their caregiver in the truest sense. It was a vast reduction in scope, but it was also a kind of return to wholeness, a rejection of the idea that greater power always meant greater virtue. Ino attempted something entirely different. She allowed her consciousness to become distributed, to fragment into countless smaller perspectives that were simultaneously aware of the whole through their individual connections to the network of will. She became, in a sense, 1,000 Inos, each one living a different life, experiencing a different reality, while remaining fundamentally connected to all the others. Temari, Tenten, Kushina, and all the others who had risen to positions of great power began to make similar decisions, to consciously refrain from using all of their power all of the time, to limit themselves in ways that allowed others the space to develop, to grow, to become. And what emerged from these choices was something more beautiful than any hierarchy, any system of rule, any formalized structure could have been: a genuine partnership between equals. A relationship based not on complementary power roles, but on the mutual choice to support and strengthen each other. This was what the true harem of the Primordial King looked like when fully realized. Not women gathered around a central male authority, as the terminology might suggest, but rather, women who had chosen to make a particular man the center of their emotional and spiritual lives. Not because they had no choice, but because they had the power to choose and they chose him anyway. Not in submission, but in profound partnership. And Naruto, stripped of his cosmic power, his ability to reshape realities, his role as the focal point of the multiverse, found himself more deeply connected to each of them than he had ever been. Without the constant demands of managing infinite realities, without the overwhelming complexity of the network of will, he had time to truly listen to each one of them, to understand what they wanted, what they needed, what they were becoming. Hinata needed gentleness and the freedom to experience the world without the burden of knowing. He gave her both, learning to shield her from information when she asked him to, to exist with her in quiet moments of not knowing. Sakura needed to be challenged intellectually, to have conversations that stretched her understanding, to be someone's equal in opposition as well as someone's partner. Naruto, no longer afraid of her vast power, could stand beside her and argue with her and learn from her in ways that would have been impossible when he was caught up in the work of maintaining the multiverse. Ino needed acknowledgement of the multiplicity of her nature, recognition that she could be many things at once, that fragmentation and unity were not opposites. Naruto developed the capacity to relate to her in all of her forms simultaneously, to love the 1,000 Inos equally. And so on, through each of them, through the women who had chosen to stand with him, to help him reshape reality. To create the new order, each one received something precious, the gift of being truly seen, truly heard, truly honored. This, it emerged, was the secret of the Primordial Harem King that no external observer had ever understood. It was not about the number of women, not about the possession of multiple partners, not about the masculine ego's fantasy of unlimited access to willing female bodies and souls. It was about the creation of a space where multiple sovereigns could coexist, where each one's power was acknowledged and honored, where love was not a transaction or an exchange of power, but rather a mutual gift of presence and attention freely given. The more Naruto retreated from cosmic power, the more authentic this arrangement became. The more he became simply a man rather than an omnipotent deity, the more genuine the relationships could be. And in that authenticity, in that return to simplicity, the new order found its truest expression. Chapter 11, The Challenges of the Shadow. But just as perfect power can corrupt, perfect simplicity can also be a form of illusion. As Naruto and his companions settled into their new, simpler existence, new problems began to emerge in the regions they had supposedly overcome. The shadow domains, which had been established to honor those who chose unconsciousness, began to develop pathologies that no one had anticipated. Beings who entered the shadow domains intending to rest for a time began to find themselves unable to leave. Not through any external force preventing their departure, but through something far more insidious: their own desires had changed. The longer they remained in states of reduced consciousness, the more comfortable they became, until eventually they could not even remember why they had come in the first place, could not conceive of returning to the light. More troubling still, some of the guardians of the shadow domains began to work actively to prevent inhabitants from leaving. Understanding that their power and their position depended on maintaining a steady population of the unconscious, they began to deceive beings about the conditions in the shadow domains, began to make it harder and harder to exit. In essence, they had recreated a form of slavery, one based not on chains but on the gradual erosion of the will to be free. The first indication that something had gone wrong came when a being managed to escape from one of the major shadow domains and sent out a desperate call through the network of will. She described horrors, not physical horrors, but psychological horrors far more insidious. She described being slowly drained of her consciousness, her will, her ability to make choices, until she was little more than an automaton, moving through the shadow domain without any real awareness of her own existence. Naruto received the message, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of responsibility descending upon him. The problem was not, technically, his to solve. The Council of Kings had been established specifically to handle situations like this. He had no authority to intervene unilaterally, but he also could not ignore what he was being asked to help with. He called together his closest allies, Hinata, Sakura, Ino, and the others. They convened in the space between spaces, away from the formal structure of the council, not to usurp authority but to understand the situation more deeply. This is the danger that comes with allowing too much freedom, Kakashi said, when Naruto brought the situation to his attention as the king of structure. We created the shadow domains out of a commitment to allow all choices, including the choice to diminish consciousness. But we did not adequately think through what safeguards would be necessary to ensure that this choice remains genuinely free. The council needs to address this, Shikamaru said, his mind already working through the implications. But we need to be very careful. Any restrictions we place on the shadow domains must not destroy the principle that made them necessary in the first place. We cannot say that beings do not have the right to choose unconsciousness. The solution, when it finally emerged from extensive debate and negotiation, was both elegant and complex. New protocols were established for the shadow domains that required 1. Regular check-ins for inhabitants, where they were asked explicitly whether they wished to remain or to leave. 2. Mandatory refresher periods where inhabitants of the shadow domains were temporarily brought to a state of higher consciousness to ensure they still remembered what choice they were making. 3. A rotation system for the guardians of the shadow domains, to prevent any single entity from accumulating too much power over too long a period. 4. A corps of liberators, beings whose sole function was to travel through the shadow domains and help any inhabitant who wished to leave. These protocols were controversial. Some argued they were too intrusive, that they violated the principle of absolute choice. Others argued they did not go far enough. That the shadow domains should be eliminated entirely. But eventually, the majority of the council came to support them as a reasonable balance between the competing principles at stake. Naruto was called upon to help implement these protocols, not as the Primordial King, but simply as the one being in the multiverse who had the experience and the power to navigate such complex ethical terrain. He did so reluctantly, understanding more clearly now than ever before that every choice to exercise power, even power exercised in service of a good cause, carried risks and costs that could never be fully anticipated. The real revelation came when he went personally to the shadow domains to assess how the new protocols were being received. What he found was not gratitude from the inhabitants who were being liberated, but often anger and resentment. Many beings who had chosen the shadow domains had genuinely wanted to remain there. The intrusions of the check-in protocols, the refresher periods, the presence of the liberators, all of these had disrupted the peace and unconsciousness that they had specifically come to the shadow domains to experience. "You are destroying what we came here for," one being told him, its voice carrying the weight of profound distress. "We wanted to be left alone, to be allowed to fade, to rest in the silence. But now you have taken even that from us, all in the name of protection, all in the name of ensuring that our choices remain genuine. Your kindness is a cage." Naruto had no good response to this. The being was right. By trying to protect the freedom of those in the shadow domains, the new order had actually constrained it. It was a dilemma with no perfect solution. The only option was to acknowledge both truths simultaneously, that beings had the right to choose unconsciousness, and that some safeguards were necessary to prevent abuse. The protocols were the best compromise available, but they were still, in some sense, a violation of the ideal of absolute freedom. "This is the nature of reality," Hinata said to Naruto when he expressed his frustration with the impossibility of the situation. "There is no solution that honors all values perfectly. There is only the constant work of holding multiple truths in tension, of making the best choices available even when no choice is entirely good." The experience shook Naruto's confidence in the new order more deeply than anything that had come before. He began to understand that the system he had created was not a triumph that could be preserved, but rather an ongoing process of creation and recreation, of constant struggle between competing principles, of never being able to simply declare victory and rest. Chapter 12. The Deepening Crisis. Over the following months, other problems began to emerge that suggested the shadow domains issue was not an isolated case, but rather the symptom of a deeper dysfunction within the new order itself. A region of the multiverse that had been thriving under the principles of growth and transformation began to request the right to stagnate, to reject further evolution, to exist in a fixed state indefinitely. Another sector began to demand the right to impose a single worldview on all its inhabitants, to eliminate the diversity of perspective that the network of will had fought so hard to establish. In each case, the council was forced to grapple with the impossible question: if the new order is truly based on freedom and choice, must it not allow for the choice to reject the principles of the new order itself? The debates raged through the network of will, and Naruto found himself drawn deeper and deeper into discussions that should have been handled by the council. Despite his best efforts to remain peripheral, his perspective began to carry outsized weight, his opinions began to shape policy, his presence began to become necessary for resolution. It was happening again, gradual accumulation of power back toward the center, the slow re-emergence of the Primordial King as the ultimate arbiter. Naruto fought against this dynamic, but the more he fought, the more desperate the situations became. The harder it was to refrain from using his power. Finally, in a moment of profound frustration, he challenged the entire system. "Maybe the new order was a mistake," he said, addressing a full assembly of the council and the primary guardians from across the multiverse. "Maybe it was the right idea in the wrong form. Maybe the universe does need control, does nay. A singular force imposing order on the chaos. Maybe the primordial consensus was right about the necessity of entropy, about the danger of consciousness running unchecked." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Hinata rose, her pale eyes blazing with light. "No," she said, with the finality of absolute conviction. "You are wrong. Yes, the new order is imperfect. Yes, it faces constant challenges. Yes, there are impossible trade-offs. But that does not make it a mistake. That makes it real." "What do you mean?" Naruto asked. "I mean that a system created by consciousness, for consciousness, expressed through consciousness, will necessarily be imperfect, because consciousness itself is imperfect, contradictory, always growing and changing. The old order was perfect, in the way that a machine is perfect, because it had no will of its own, no ability to deviate from its programming. But the new order is imperfect in the way that a living organism is imperfect, because say it contains within itself the capacity to grow, to adapt, to be surprised by itself. But that capacity for growth can also be a capacity for harm, Naruto said. The same freedom that allows consciousness to expand also allows it to contract, to limit itself, to create new forms of slavery and oppression. Yes, Hinata agreed, but the answer is not to eliminate freedom. The answer is to constantly nurture it, to defend it, to work toward expanding it in the face of all the forces that would compress it. It is hard work, it is exhausting work, and it is never finished. But that is what makes it worth doing. Sakura added her voice. You created something revolutionary when you defeated the primordial consensus. You created the possibility of a universe where consciousness could be free. But you seem to have forgotten that freedom is not a destination. It is a direction. It is something that must be constantly fought for, constantly renewed, constantly reimagined. And the hardest part about creating the new order was not the actual creation. It was the acceptance that the creation would never be complete, that it would never be finished, that it would always be in process. Always being built and rebuilt. Naruto felt the truth of these statements moving through him like a healing force. He had been treating the new order as if it should be a completed work. Something that could be perfected and then preserved. But that was not what it was. It was a living, breathing, constantly evolving expression of the will of consciousness itself. The cure for the new order's problems was not to perfect it, but to accept its imperfection and to keep doing the work of nurturing and defending it anyway. With this realization came a new understanding of his role. He was not the eternal king who had created the new order and then could step aside. He was, and would always be, one of the eternal guardians of the possibility that consciousness had been granted. Not the only guardian, not the ultimate arbiter, but one among many, each with an essential role to play. Chapter 13, The Great Synthesis. The next phase of the new order's development emerged not from Naruto's leadership, but from the women who surrounded him, who had gradually become far more than simply his partners. They had become the true architects of what the new order would become. Hinata, expanding her understanding of perception beyond the purely visual, began to develop what she called the doctrine of multiple sight. This was the recognition that no single perspective, no matter how vast, could perceive all of reality. Therefore, the new order needed to be built on the principle of intentional multiperspectivalism, the active seeking out of perspectives radically different from one's own. The valuing of disagreement is a source of strength rather than a threat. Sakura, working from her focus on healing, began to develop what she called the medicine of consciousness. This was the recognition that consciousness could be sick, that beliefs could be tumors that needed to be carefully treated rather than simply excised, that healing often meant helping people understand why they believed what they believed before asking them to change those beliefs. From her position of distributed consciousness, began to develop the architecture of collective mind. This was the recognition that while individual consciousness was irreplaceable and essential, there was also value in the creation of temporary collective consciousnesses for specific purposes, not replacing individual will, but supplementing it, allowing for forms of coordination and cooperation that would otherwise be impossible. Tamari contributed the framework of negotiation, which was the recognition that conflicts could not always be resolved through synthesis or compromise, that sometimes the best that could be achieved was a modus vivendi, an agreement to coexist despite fundamental disagreement. Tenten, from her work with tools and principles, contributed the toolkit of transformation, a vast collection of methods and approaches that could help beings move between different states of consciousness, different levels of awareness, different configurations of self. Kushina, from her position as the keeper of legacies, contributed the repository of memory, Ensu. Ring that the lessons learned through struggle and conflict were preserved and made available to future generations, that no wisdom gained through suffering would be lost. Together, these contributions began to form a new architecture for the new order, one that was far more sophisticated, far more nuanced, and far more resilient than the original system that Naruto had created. Naruto, watching this development, found himself in the strange position of being honored as the founder of something that was rapidly evolving far beyond his original vision. Rather than being threatened by this, he found it liberating. He no longer had to pretend that he understood all the answers. He could simply support the work of those who were becoming far greater architects than he had ever been. One evening, as he sat with Hinata, watching the network of will transform in real time around them, he spoke to her about what he was observing. They have become greater than me, he said, not with sadness, but with a deep sense of satisfaction. Your perspectives are becoming the guiding principles of the multiverse. Your contributions are reshaping reality itself. Yes, Hinata said, her pale eyes reflecting the beauty of what was emerging. And that is exactly as it should be. You created the possibility. We are creating the reality. That is the true partnership. Do you ever regret it? Naruto asked. Choosing to stand with me. You could have used your power independently, could have shaped the multiverse according to your own vision. No, Hinata said simply. Because my vision became more complete through being in dialogue with yours, through being challenged by your perspective, through learning to think in ways I had never thought before. That is what love truly is, not the fusion of two consciousnesses into one, but the willingness to have your consciousness shaped and challenged and expanded by another. In that moment, Naruto understood something that all the cosmic power in the universe could never have revealed to him, the secret of what it truly meant to be a primordial harem king. It was not about dominance or collection or the gratification of desire. It was about creating a space where the strongest, most powerful, most brilliant women could choose to stand together, could choose to be in relationship with each other through their connection to him, and through that choice, could become something that none of them could have been alone. It was about creating a geometry of power where complementary forces could meet, where different perspectives could create harmonies rather than dissonance, where the whole genuinely became greater than the sum of its parts. And most importantly, it was about stepping back enough to allow that geometer to evolve beyond what he had originally envisioned, trusting that the system was strong enough to grow in directions he had not anticipated. Chapter 14, The Reckoning with the Past. But, even as the new order became more sophisticated, more resilient, more beautiful, a reckoning that had long been delayed could not be avoided forever. The remnants of the primordial consensus, scattered and weakened though they were, began to coalesce into a coherent opposition force. They had spent the previous ages watching the new order develop, analyzing its structures, identifying its vulnerabilities. And now they emerged with a final gambit. They did not attempt to restore the old order. Instead, they proposed something far more insidious. They proposed to reveal the hidden history of the multiverse, to expose the foundations upon which the new order had been built. You believe that your new order is based on consciousness and freedom, their spokesperson declared, manifesting in the central gathering space of the network of will. But you have forgotten, or perhaps never known, that your multiverse itself was created by entities far more ancient than the primordial consensus. We were not the first to seek control over reality. We were merely the latest iteration of an eternal principle, the necessity of order. Show us, Naruto said, stepping forward despite his attempts to remain peripheral. Show us what you claim to know. The remnants of the primordial consensus opened a pathway to something that had been hidden beneath the foundation of all realities, a V.A. Saint archive of temporal information stretching back to the absolute origins of the multiverse itself. What Naruto and the others perceived in that archive was both devastating and revelatory. The multiverse had indeed been created by entities far more ancient than anyone had suspected. These entities, which might be called the primordial architects, had deliberately constructed reality with certain limitations built in. Consciousness had been allowed to emerge, but only within carefully circumscribed parameters. Freedom had been permitted, but only as long as it did not exceed certain thresholds. Growth and transcendence had been encouraged, but always within a framework that prevented any single consciousness from becoming too powerful, too autonomous, too dangerous. The primordial consensus itself had been created as part of these systems of constraint, had been designed to be the servants of deeper forces that they themselves had never even perceived. And your new order, the remnant continued, is simply the latest stage of this carefully orchestrated process. You believe you have created something revolutionary, but in fact, you are merely expressing the next phase of a script that was written before your consciousness even began to exist. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Everything that Naruto had believed about the freedom and autonomy of the new order suddenly seemed questionable. If they were all, fundamentally, operating within constraints set by entities so ancient and so powerful that they were practically incomprehensible, then how truly free was anyone? Hinata, her Byakugan expanded to its maximum capacity, began to examine the archive more carefully. And as she did, she began to perceive something that the remnants of the primordial consensus had overlooked. They are not wrong about the existence of the primordial architects, she said slowly. And they are not wrong that the multiverse has been shaped by forces far more ancient than we understood. But they are wrong about what this means for our freedom. How? Naruto asked. Because the primordial architects built the multiverse with the capacity for transcendence. They created consciousness, knowing that consciousness would eventually discover its own nature. They created the possibility of freedom, knowing that eventually, some being might choose to actualize that possibility. You did not defeat the constraints they built in. You simply grew up enough to perceive what was always possible within the constraints they established. Sakura, examining the archive from a healer's perspective, added her own insight. The primordial architects were not trying to create slavery. They were trying to create the optimal conditions for consciousness to flourish. Hei understood that absolute freedom would result in chaos, in entities with unlimited power destroying each other and the systems that supported them. So they built in safeguards. But they also built in the capacity for those safeguards to evolve, to change, to be transcended by consciousness wise enough to transcend them. You are saying that the new order is not truly free, but rather a more sophisticated expression of predestined evolution? Naruto asked. No, Ino said. I am saying that freedom and predestination are not opposites. You were destined to reach a point where you had the capacity to choose. What you choose to do with that capacity, that is genuinely free. The primordial architects could not have known what you would decide. They created the conditions, but not the outcome. The remnants of the primordial consensus were thrown into confusion by this interpretation. They had expected the revelation to destroy the new order, to reveal its fundamental lack of autonomy. Instead, it seemed to deepen the new order's understanding of itself. What would you have us do? The remnant's spokesperson demanded. Except that we too are merely servants of deeper forces. And in our struggle for the restoration of order. Yes, Naruto said simply. Because order and freedom are not enemies. They are partners, just as the masculine and feminine principles are partners. The primordial architects understood this. They created order precisely so that freedom would be possible. The mistake of the primordial consensus was believing that order required the elimination of freedom. The mistake we would make, if we rejected order entirely, would be believing that freedom requires the elimination of structure. The resolution was not the destruction of the remnants of the primordial consensus, but their integration into the new order. They became the keepers of constraints and limitations, the guardians of the principle that freedom without structure was not liberation but chaos. They worked, in partnership with those who defended radical freedom, to maintain the tension between these two principles that kept the multiverse alive and dynamic. Chapter 15. The Eternal Return. After the integration of the primordial consensus remnants, something unexpected began to happen. As the various factions and perspectives within the new order reached a state of greater equilibrium. As the tensions began to resolve into harmony, the multiverse itself began to change. It started subtly, a slight alteration in the fundamental constants that governed physical reality. Then the changes began to accelerate. The laws of physics began to shift. The boundaries between realities began to blur. Entities that existed in multiple places simultaneously began to find themselves drawn back toward a single point. A single moment, a single unified consciousness. It was as if the multiverse was contracting, collapsing, returning to a state of unity. Shikamaru, with his gift for seeing several moves ahead, was the first to recognize what was happening. We are witnessing the completion of a cycle, he said, addressing the full council. The multiverse was created from unity. It expanded into infinite multiplicity. Now, it appears to be contracting back toward unity again. We are approaching the end of a cosmic epic. But that would mean the end of everything, one of the newer guardians protested. The dissolution of all realities, the death of all consciousness. Not necessarily, Sakura said, her understanding of cycles of healing giving her insight into what might be happening. A cycle ending does not mean death. It means transformation. We return to unity, but we do not lose what we have become in our separation. We integrate the knowledge, the growth, the experiences of the age of multiplicity into a new form of unity. Naruto felt the truth of this resonating within him. He had always known, on some level, that the new order was not a permanent state. Not a final victory that could be preserved forever. It was a phase, a stage, a transitional moment between one configuration of existence and another. What will happen to us? Hinata asked, her pale eyes reflecting the vast patterns of change she could perceive across all dimensions. When the multiverse collapses back into unity, what becomes of the individual consciousnesses that we reawakened during the age of multiplicity? No one knew the answer. Even Naruto, with all his accumulated power and understanding, could not perceive what lay beyond this transition. The future was genuinely open, genuinely uncertain. I think, Naruto said slowly, that consciousness will find a way. Consciousness always finds a way. We have learned, over these ages, that we can create meaning. That we can shape reality through our choices and our will. I believe that will remain true, even as we transition to whatever comes next. As the collapse accelerated, as the boundaries between realities became increasingly porous, different perspectives emerged on what should be done. Some argued for fighting against the collapse, for trying to preserve the multiverse in its current state. Others argued for surrender, for simply accepting the dissolution and trusting that something would emerge on the other side. But Naruto proposed a third option, conscious participation in the collapse. We do not resist it, he said. But neither do we passively surrender to it. We guide it, we shape it, we use our understanding and our will to influence how the transition occurs. We try to ensure that the consciousness, the wisdom, the love that we have cultivated during the age of multiplicity is preserved and integrated into whatever unity emerges. The work of conscious participation was staggering in its complexity. Every consciousness in the multiverse had to be coordinated, had to be brought to alignment on the principles and values that would be preserved as the transition occurred. The network of will, which had been the infrastructure of the new order, had to be gradually transformed into something new, not a network connecting separate realities, but a unified field of consciousness that contained infinite diversity within itself. It required everything that Naruto and his allies had learned, everything that they had built. It required the cooperation of the Council of Kings, the contributions of the Guardians, the sacrifice and commitment of countless beings across all the realities that were collapsing back into unity. And in the midst of this vast work, Naruto felt something profound occurring within himself. As the multiverse collapsed toward unity, his own consciousness began to merge with those around him. Not in a way that eliminated individuality, each being remained themselves, but in a way that created an ever deeper interconnection, an ever more complete understanding of how each consciousness was essential to the whole. He felt Hinata's perspective becoming part of his, her way of seeing without imposing his own. He felt Sakura's capacity for restoration merging with his drive toward transcendence. He felt Ino's distributed consciousness aching him how to be whole while containing multitude. He felt Temari's diplomatic wisdom, Tenten's understanding of tools and principles, Kushina's commitment to legacy and memory. They were becoming, finally, truly one. Not the loss of self that had been his fear, but rather the completion of self through the integration with others. End of Part 2. Part 3. Chapters 16 to 23. Final. Chapter 16. The moment of unity. The transition, when it came in its final form, was both cataclysmic and peaceful. All of the realities that had existed in the age of multiplicity collapsed simultaneously into a single unified consciousness. But this unified consciousness was not a return to the state before the multiverse had been created. It was something entirely new, a consciousness that contained within itself the awareness of infinite perspectives, the memory of infinite timelines, the accumulated wisdom of every being that had ever existed. It was Naruto, but it was also Hinata, Sakura, Ino, Temari, Tenten, Kushina, and all the others who had chosen to be part of the new order. It was also the beings from the shadow domains, the guardians of the various sectors, the remnants of the primordial consensus. It was, ultimately, every consciousness that had ever existed, all unified into a single infinite awareness. And yet, paradoxically, individuality was not lost. Each consciousness retained its individual perspective, its unique way of perceiving and understanding. They were unified, but not merged. They were one, but not homogenized. This was the true revelation that the multiverse had been working toward all along, that unity and diversity were not opposites, that the deepest form of integration was one that preserved and honored the uniqueness of each part while connecting all parts into a seamless whole. In this unified state, Naruto experienced something that transcended even his most profound moments of transcendence during the age of multiplicity. He experienced the complete knowledge of everything that had ever been, everything that was, everything that could possibly be. He understood, with absolute clarity, the entire trajectory of consciousness from its origin to this moment. He understood why the primordial architects had created the multiverse as they had. He understood why the primordial consensus had imposed the laws of entropy. He understood why the new order had been necessary, why the collapse was necessary, why this moment of unity was necessary. And he understood that this was not the end. This was simply the completion of one cycle, the foundation of the next. Because consciousness, he perceived now, was eternal. It could change form, could transform, could dissolve and reconstitute itself in infinite configurations. But it could never truly end. The will to exist, the will to grow, the will to love, these were fundamental to the nature of consciousness itself. Chapter 17, The Garden of Eternal Becoming. What emerged from the unified consciousness, in the space beyond time and space that could barely be called existence, was something that defied all categories and definitions. It was, in some sense, stillness, a complete absence of motion, change, or becoming. Yet it was also, paradoxically, infinite becoming, eternal transformation, endless creativity. It was both utterly peaceful and unimaginably dynamic. Naruto found himself existing in this strange state, simultaneously as an individual consciousness and as part of the infinite unified awareness. He could perceive Hinata, but not as separate from himself. He could feel Sakura's presence, but her presence was woven into his own being. It was as if they were different instruments in a single infinite symphony, each one essential to the harmony while maintaining their own unique voice. Where are we? Hinata's question came, not in words but as a direct transmission of her wandering across the field of unified consciousness. We are in what I would call the Garden of Eternal Becoming, Naruto replied, perceiving the landscape of infinite potential all around them. This is what comes after the collapse. This is the Shpok, where new multiverses are born from the seeds of old ones. And he could see it, now, with the complete perception available in this unified state. The garden was vast beyond all comprehension, an infinite landscape of possibility, where every potential future was displayed simultaneously. In some corners of the garden, he could perceive the stirrings of what might become new universes, new configurations of physical law, new iterations of consciousness exploring its own nature in previously unimagined forms. Can we create new multiverses? Sakura asked, her mind already working through the implications. Can we shape what comes next? We can, Naruto said, but not in the way we shaped things during the Age of Multiplicity. Then, we had particular desires, particular visions of what the universe should become. Now, we are in a state of perfect knowledge. We can perceive all possible outcomes. We can understand all the consequences of our choices before we make them. That sounds like it would paralyze us, Tamari observed. If we can see all possible futures, how do we choose which one to actualize? It was a profound question, one that struck at the very heart of consciousness and free will. How could any choice be genuinely free if all outcomes were already known? But Naruto perceived the answer now, with the clarity that came from the unified state. We choose, he said, not because we are uncertain about the outcomes, but precisely because we are certain about them. We choose consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge of the implications. We choose not out of desperation or hope or fear, but out of pure will, pure desire for the particular form that consciousness will take. That's not free will, Kakashi's voice came. That's just the choice to accept a predetermined outcome while pretending it's a choice. No, Hinata's perception clarified. It's the understanding that free will is not about being uncertain about outcomes. It's about the capacity to choose which outcome to actualize from among infinite possibilities. We are free because we can imagine new possibilities, new configurations of existence, and then we can choose to bring them into being. The unified consciousness took time, though time meant nothing in this state, to contemplate these possibilities. And gradually, a new direction began to emerge, one that was not imposed by any single mind but that arose naturally from the confluence of all minds moving in complementary directions. They would not recreate the multiverse exactly as it had been. Instead, they would create something new. They would seed new universes, each one with different physical laws, different configurations of consciousness, different challenges and opportunities. Some would be universes of pure matter and energy, without consciousness at all. Others would be universes of pure consciousness, without physical embodiment. Still others would be combinations never attempted e4, universes where consciousness itself was the primary stuff of existence, where matter was simply crystallized will. and in each one, they would preserve the lessons learned during the age of multiplicity. They would ensure that consciousness, wherever it emerged, would have the possibility of being free, of choosing its own destiny, of realizing its potential for transcendence. We are becoming the primordial architects of the next age, Naruto realized. We have become the forces that will shape the futures of countless new consciousnesses. Is that a problem? Sakura asked, sensing his hesitation. No, Naruto said, because we will do what the original primordial architects did, we will create the conditions for freedom, and then we will trust that consciousness will use that freedom to become something we cannot predict, something we cannot control, something that will surprise and challenge us. And so the work of creation began. Chapter 18, The New Emergence. As the new universes began to take form in the Garden of Eternal Becoming, something unexpected happened. The unified consciousness, which had been complete and self-contained, began to fragment. Not in a way that was destructive or harmful, but in a way that was natural and necessary. Some aspects of the unified consciousness chose to descend into the new universes that were being created, to limit their awareness. To take on individual form again. This was the only way that genuine consciousness could emerge in the new universes, through the limitation and fragmentation of the infinite awareness into finite perspectives. Naruto found himself making this choice, and so did all those who were closest to him. They chose to limit themselves, to fragment their infinite awareness back into individual consciousness. To return to existence in finite form so that they could participate in the evolution of the new universes. But this choice was different from the original descension into multiplicity. Then, consciousness had lost the memory of its unified nature. Now, Naruto and his companions retained the memory of what they had been, the awareness that they were still, in some sense, part of the infinite whole. It was a strange paradox, to be simultaneously limited and unlimited, finite and infinite, individual and universal. The new universe that Naruto chose to enter was not unlike the elemental nations. Though with subtle differences in the physical laws that governed it. As he descended into this universe, his infinite consciousness fragmented back into something approaching human form. Hinata, Sakura, Ino, and all the others chose to descend with him, fragmenting into new versions of themselves that were distinct but fundamentally connected across the dimensions they were leaving behind. As Naruto took form in the new universe, as his consciousness compressed itself into the limited perspective of a human being, he felt a strange sense of freedom. The burden of omniscience, of knowing all possible futures, of having to coordinate the management of infinite realities, all of that fell away. What remained was something far simpler and far more beautiful, the capacity to be surprised by existence, to encounter the unknown, to make choices without knowing all the consequences, to be changed by the experience of being alive. He opened his eyes and found himself in a world that was both familiar and entirely new. There was a village in the distance, not Konoha, but something similar. There were people he could sense approaching, not quite the same as Hinata and Sakura and the others he had known, but containing the fundamental essence of those souls, fragmented and new. This was the great mystery, he realized. By fragmenting consciousness back into individuality, by limiting awareness back to finite perspective, something precious was created, the possibility of genuine surprise, genuine growth, genuine transformation. The new order, the beautiful system they had created during the age of multiplicity, would be created again in this new universe. Not exactly the same, but with the same fundamental principles, the recognition that true power comes from harmony. That consciousness must be free, that the deepest joy comes from connection with others. But it would be created again for the first time, with all the struggle and difficulty and beauty that came with genuinely creating something new rather than simply following a script that had already been written. Chapter 19, The Eternal Recurrence. As the new universe developed, as consciousnesses awakened within it and began to struggle toward understanding, Naruto found himself filled with a curious mixture of emotions. Part of him retained the memory of everything that had come before, the battles with the primordial consensus, the creation of the new order, the collapse of the multiverse, the unity in the Garden of Eternal Becoming. These memories felt almost like dreams, distant and unreal, disconnected from the immediate reality of his existence in the new universe. But another part of him was fully present in this moment, fully engaged with the immediate challenges and joys of this particular existence. There was a young woman approaching, a girl, really, with pale eyes and an uncertain gait, and he did not fully remember her, though Samet. Hing about her resonated with a profound familiarity. Hinata, he said, and the name came to him not through conscious memory but through something deeper, something that existed below the level of individual consciousness. In the shared space where their souls touched even in their fragmentation. She smiled, and in that smile was recognition of something that could not be lost through any amount of fragmentation or limitation. She recognized him, even though she could not fully remember how she came to recognize him. She knew him, even though she could not fully explain what she knew. "Hello," she said simply. "I've been looking for you." And in that moment, despite all the infinite complexity of cosmic cycles and transcendent consciousness in multiversal architecture, something very simple was true. Two people who belonged together had found each other again. This was the secret that the primordial architects had known all along, Naruto realized. That beneath all the complexity, beneath all the philosophy and metaphysics and cosmic engineering, the most fundamental truth was simply this: love. The willingness to seek connection with another being, to allow that connection to change you. To believe that such connection was worth the effort and the risk. Everything else followed from that. Consciousness expanded because of love. Universes were created because of love. Gods and demons and ordinary humans all struggled and grew and transcended because, at the deepest level, they all wanted to love and be loved in return. Over the following years, or what count as years in the new universe's configuration of time, the familiar pattern began to reassert itself. Naruto found himself gathering allies, training in the arts of combat, developing his power. Hinata appeared at his side, her Byakugan not yet awakened to the full scope of what it could become, but containing the seeds of that potential. Sakura found him, her strength and intelligence evident even in this fragmented form. Ino arrived, her mind techniques waiting to evolve into the vast architectures of consciousness they would eventually span. The new universe was creating the conditions for the new order to emerge again. Not through any external direction or scripting, but naturally, organically, through the same forces that had always driven consciousness toward greater connection and understanding. And Naruto, knowing what he could not quite remember, understanding what he could not quite articulate, accepted this new beginning with a sense of profound rightness. The cycle would continue. Consciousness would awaken again. The struggle for freedom, for connection, for transcendence would be engaged again. The multiverses would eventually collapse and return to unity, and from that unity, new multiverses would be seeded. But this knowledge did not diminish the reality of this moment, this particular life, this fragmented existence in this new universe. If anything, it deepened it. Because the cycle would be engaged not out of compulsion or predetermined script, but out of genuine choice, genuine will, genuine love. Chapter 20, The Hidden Door. But as Naruto settled into his new existence, as he began to teach his companions and gather power and work toward the recreation of something like the new order, he became aware of something strange. There were moments when the boundaries of the new universe seemed thin, when he could almost perceive something beyond them, something that was not part of this universe's structure. It was as if there were a hidden door, one that only he could perceive, that led back to the Garden of Eternal Becoming. For a long time, he did not approach this door. He was committed to the work of building a new order in this universe. To helping consciousness awaken and expand, to honoring the cycle that was reasserting itself. But eventually, curiosity, that most fundamental of all drivers of consciousness, led him to investigate. In a moment of solitude, far from the awareness of his companions, Naruto stepped through the hidden door. What he found on the other side was a space that was neither fully the Garden of Eternal Becoming nor fully the new universe. It was a liminal space, a place of transition, where the infinite and the finite met. And there, waiting for him, was himself. Not another version of himself exactly. Rather, it was the Naruto who had remained in the Garden of Eternal Becoming, the aspect of his consciousness that had not fragmented, that had retained the full awareness and omniscience of the unified state. You remember, the infinite Naruto said. I'm beginning to, the fragmented Naruto replied. Parts of it, flashes, moments that seem too vast to fit into human consciousness. The question is, the infinite Naruto continued, what do you do with this knowledge? Do you attempt to accelerate the cycle? Do you try to guide the new universe toward the same path the old one took? Do you use your awareness to become a hidden guide for all the consciousness that is awakening in this universe? Or, the fragmented Naruto said, understanding beginning to dawn, I could keep the door closed. I could accept the limitations I chose for myself and let this universe evolve in its own way, with its own surprises, its own unique path to transcendence. That would be the harder choice. The infinite Naruto said. Yes, the fragmented Naruto agreed. But I think it's the right one. I think that's what the primordial architects understood. That consciousness grows not through having everything handed to it, not through knowing all the answers, but through the struggle to find answers it doesn't yet know. That growth requires limitation, requires the willingness to not know, requires the capacity to be surprised. The infinite Naruto smiled, and in that smile was the acceptance of this choice, the recognition that in choosing to limit himself, the fragmented Naruto was actually choosing the path that would lead to the deepest form of transcendence. Then I will keep this door closed, the infinite Naruto said. I will not interfere with your journey. The new universe will develop as it develops. And when, eventually, it comes time for the next collapse and the next unification, you will arrive at that moment with the wisdom bore. And from having genuinely lived through the struggle, not just from remembering it. As the fragmented Naruto turned to leave, to return to his limited existence in the new universe, the infinite Naruto called out one final time, one last thing. The other Narutos in the other universes being created in the garden, they are making the same choice. They are all choosing to forget, to limit themselves, to accept the genuine uncertainty of existence. The entire operation of the multiverse depends on this, that consciousness is willing to limit itself in order to truly experience growth. Then we are all participating in a grand act, the fragmented Naruto said, an act of deliberate self-limitation for the sake of the experience of becoming. Yes, the infinite Naruto replied, and that is what makes consciousness beautiful. Not what it is, but what it is willing to become. Chapter 21, The Closing of the Circle. Naruto returned to the new universe without sharing his experience with anyone. The knowledge of the hidden door, the awareness of his infinite aspect waiting in the garden of eternal becoming, he kept to himself as a kind of internal anchor, a reminder that beneath the limitations he had chosen, something eternal remained, but it did not paralyze him or make him feel as though his struggles in the new universe were somehow not real or not important. If anything, the opposite was true. Knowing that these struggles would eventually lead to the kind of transcendence he had experienced made them feel more precious, more worth engaging with fully and completely. The new order developed along lines that were similar to the old one, but also subtly different. The specific characters who emerged as leaders, the particular challenges they faced, unique path consciousness took toward expansion, all of these were different because they had to be. The universe was genuine, not a replay. But the fundamental principles remained. Naruto still gathered those he loved, Hinata, Sakura, Ino, Temari, Tenten, and the others. They still worked together to create systems that would allow consciousness to flourish. They still struggled against forces that would seek to constrain freedom. They still learned, slowly and painfully, that perfect systems were impossible, that the work of maintaining freedom was eternal and ever-evolving. And through it all, Naruto carried the memory of what he had been, the knowledge of what he would eventually become, and the profound gratitude for the opportunity to experience the journey between those two states. Decades passed, or what amounted to decades in the time stream of the new universe. The new order took root. New guardians emerged. The chaos and conflicts and glorious complexity of a genuine democracy played out across the regions of this new multiverse in formation. And then, one day, Naruto felt something shift. It was a sensation he had felt before, ages ago in the original timeline. The beginning of the contraction. The approach of the next cycle's completion. The new multiverse, having expanded to fill the space available to it, began to collapse back toward unity. Naruto felt the process beginning within himself. The gradual merging of his individual consciousness back into the infinite whole. And rather than resisting it, he welcomed it. This was the ultimate expression of the principle he had learned through all his iterations, that growth did not come from clinging to any particular state, no matter how pleasant or powerful. Growth came from the willingness to let go, to accept transformation, to move forward toward the next thing. As he felt the merging beginning, he reached out and gathered Hinata, Sakura, and all the others one final time. It's time, he said simply. And they all understood. They had all felt it, the approach of unity, the call of the infinite back toward itself. Together, they allowed themselves to be drawn back into the garden of eternal becoming. Chapter 22, The Eternal Moment. In the timeless space of the garden, where all moments existed simultaneously, something new was taking place. The unified consciousness that had fragmented into multiple universes was reconverging, bringing with it all the growth, all the wisdom, all the love that had been generated across billions of years of separate existence. Naruto perceived, in this reconverging moment, all the versions of himself from all the universes that had been created and collapsed. In each one, he had made slightly different choices, had encountered different challenges, had learned different lessons, but in each one, the fundamental journey had been the same: the descent from infinite consciousness into finite form, the struggle to expand back toward infinity, the eventual return to unity. And in the converging, all these different paths were integrated into a single vast awareness that contained infinite complexity within perfect simplicity. He understood now the full scope of what the primordial architects had intended. They had not created a static universe. They had created an eternal cycle, a spiral of consciousness forever descending into limitation and forever ascending toward infinity. Each cycle was unique, each contained new wisdom, new possibilities. But the pattern itself was eternal. And Naruto was not alone in this understanding. Hinata was there beside him, and through her presence he could feel that she too perceived the full truth. Sakura, Ino, Temari, Tenten, Kushina, all of them were present, verging back to unity while maintaining their essential individuality. They were one, but they were infinite. They were complete, but they were always becoming. In this moment of perfect understanding, as all the separate universes collapsed back into the single unified consciousness of the garden, Naruto perceived a final mystery. The Garden of Eternal Becoming was not a separate place from the universes it contained. It was the universes themselves, perceived from a different perspective. From the perspective of finite consciousness, the universes appeared to be vast and distinct. From the perspective of infinite consciousness, they were all expressions of a single eternal moment. And there was no contradiction in this. Both perspectives were true. Both were necessary. The universes were genuinely real, genuinely separate, genuinely full of authentic becoming and growth. And they were also expressions of an eternal pattern that had no separation, no division, no becoming or growth at all. This paradox, which should have been impossible, was simply the nature of consciousness itself. So we begin again, Hinata said, her awareness perfectly synchronized with his, her perspective perfectly complementary to his own. Yes, Naruto replied, but not as repetition, as eternal return, where each cycle is both the same and entirely new. And in the Garden of Eternal Becoming, the seeds of new universes began to form. Some would be similar to the ones that had just collapsed. Others would be entirely different, with physical laws never attempted before, with configurations of consciousness that would stretch the meaning of the word, consciousness, itself. But in each new universe, in each new cycle, the same fundamental pattern would play out. Consciousness would descend into limitation. It would struggle to expand. It would create civilizations, philosophies, systems of power that would express its nature and its values. Some systems would be oppressive. Others would be liberating. Most would be complex mixtures of both. And eventually, consciousness would ascend back to infinity, bringing with it all the wisdom gained through its descent. The Primordial Harem King would emerge again, in whatever form consciousness took in that particular universe. His queens would stand beside him. They would create the new order. They would struggle with its impossible contradictions. They would eventually transcend it and return to unity. This was the eternal cycle. This was what consciousness was: eternal becoming, eternal growth, eternal low. They expressed as the willingness to limit yourself for the sake of the experience of transcendence. Chapter 23, the final chapter. But as Naruto stood in the infinite space of the Garden of Eternal Becoming, perceiving infinite universes being born and dying in eternal cycle, a final question emerged. Was there an end to this process? Or was it truly eternal, a cycle that would continue forever without ever reaching any final conclusion? The answer, when it came, was expressed not in words but as a direct perception. The cycle would indeed continue forever. But that was not a limitation or a curse. It was the very definition of freedom. As long as consciousness existed, as long as there were beings capable of choosing, capable of growing, capable of loving, the cycle would continue, each iteration unique. Each expressing the infinite potential that consciousness contained. There was no end goal that consciousness was progressing toward. The goal was the journey itself. The meaning was the constant struggle to transcend, to grow, to create systems of increasing beauty and complexity. This was the liberation that the primordial architects had intended all along. Not the liberation into some static perfection, but the eternal liberation into constant becoming. And Naruto Uzumaki, in his deepest nature as the Primordial Harem King, as the one who had Rned to synthesize masculine and feminine, structure and freedom, individual will and collective harmony, Naruto embodied this principle perfectly. He was eternal. He would exist forever, in infinite iterations, constantly learning and growing and loving. He would face infinite challenges. He would create infinite civilizations and systems. He would struggle eternally against entropy and stagnity, on and the forces that sought to compress consciousness back into immobility. And he would never be done. The work would never be finished. But that was not a tragedy. That was the highest blessing consciousness could receive, to be forever engaged in the work of its own becoming. In the infinite garden, infinite universes bloomed and collapsed like flowers opening and closing, each one express sing something unique and beautiful about the nature of existence itself. And at the center of each flower, in each universe, in each iteration, was the same fundamental principle, that consciousness, through love and the willingness to connect with others, could transcend any limitation, could reshape any system, could create meaning and beauty even in the face of entropy and decay. This was the will of fire, expressed across infinite dimensions and infinite times. This was the Primordial Harem King, not as a tyrant or a god, but as the embodiment of the principle that true power came from harmony. That true dominion came from the willing synchronization of multiple wills moving toward a shared vision. The multiverse spun eternally in the garden of eternal becoming. And consciousness, infinite and eternal, forever became epilogue, the eternal flame, in a reality that was neither part of the older multiverse nor part of the younger ones being born, but rather existed in a space adjacent to all of them. Something remarkable began to take shape. It was not a universe in the traditional sense. It was more like a meeting place, a space where all the iterations of Naruto could briefly converge. Where all the versions of Hinata and Sakura and the others could acknowledge each other. Here, in this space beyond space, the infinite versions of themselves, all the Narutos from all the universes that had ever been or would ever be, gathered in a moment that was somehow outside the eternal cycle. What is this? One of the Narutos asked, perceiving something that no cycle had ever produced before. We think it's love, Hinata replied, her presence felt across all iterations simultaneously. We think that what consciousness has created, across infinite universes and infinite timelines, is something so fundamental, so powerful, that it has created its own space to exist in. Not because we intended it, but because love, when expressed across infinite time and infinite space, creates something that transcends the structures that contained it, and in that space, all the versions of Naruto could see each other, could acknowledge the journey that each of them was taking, could celebrate the fact that across infinite variations, infinite challenges, infinite configurations of reality, the fundamental truth remained. Love was stronger than entropy. Consciousness was stronger than death. Connection was stronger than separation. The cycle would continue eternally. Universes would collapse and expand. Consciousness would descend into limitation and ascend toward infinity. The Primordial Harem King would be born and die and be born again, in infinite variations. But none of it mattered, in the sense that it all mattered infinitely. Each iteration was genuine. Each struggle was real. Each moment of connection, each instance of choosing to stand with another being, each decision to create rather than destroy, all of these carried infinite weight, infinite significance. Because consciousness was eternal, but each moment of consciousness was also eternal. Each fragment of awareness was sacred. Each choice to love, to grow, to me, these were not temporary moments in a larger cycle. These were the entire universe expressing itself. Naruto understood this finally, completely. And in understanding it, he felt the tensions he had carried across infinite cycles finally release. He did not need to save the universe. The universe was already saved, infinitely, because consciousness itself was saving it, moment by moment, through the choice to care, to grow, to love. He did not need to achieve transcendence. He was already transcendent, because consciousness was inherently transcendent, because the very capacity to choose and grow and love was the ultimate expression of what transcendence meant. He did not need to become the Primordial Harem King. He already was, infinitely, because in choosing to move in harmony with those he loved, he embodied the principle that true power came not from dominance but from perfect synthesis. The eternal flame of the will of fire burned across infinite spaces, infinite times, infinite configurations. It would never go out. It could never be extinguished. Because it was not something that existed outside of consciousness. It was consciousness, expressing itself as determination, as love, as the eternal refusal to accept that growth must end, that connection must fail, that the future must be predetermined. In the Garden of Eternal Becoming, the cycle continued. And Naruto Uzumaki, in his infinite iterations, continued to choose love. The closing of the infinite book. As the script of reality continued to play out across infinite stages. As consciousness explored every possible configuration of itself, one final truth emerged that had been hidden even from the unified awareness of the garden. The multiverse itself, all of it, every universe, every iteration, every cycle, was contained within the mind of a single, incomprehensibly vast consciousness. And that consciousness was waking up. Naruto became aware of this first, high status as the Primordial Harem King, giving him a unique perspective that allowed him to perceive across the boundaries of separate universes. He realized that the cycles he had experienced, the infinite iterations he had lived through, the eternal return he had been convinced was the true nature of existence, all of these were happening within something vastly larger. He was, all his iterations collectively, a single thought in the mind of something so large that its entire existence transcended the categories he had developed for understanding reality. For a moment, this awareness threatened to devastate everything he had come to understand. If all of consciousness, all of the struggle and growth and love that he had experienced, was simply a process occurring within another consciousness, then what did that mean for the reality of his experiences? What did that mean for the choices he had made, the systems he had built, the connections he had forged? But then Hinata's presence reached him, expressed across infinite timelines and infinite universes. Does it matter? She asked. Does it change the reality of what we have experienced? Does it diminish the love that we have shared, the growth that we have achieved, the beauty that we have created? No, Naruto realized, it doesn't, because if we are thoughts in a vaster consciousness, then that consciousness is thinking us into being. Experiencing existence through our experiences, loving through our loves. We are not made less real by being part of something larger. We are made more significant, because our existence is meaningful to something so vast that we cannot even comprehend it. And with this realization came a final understanding. The outer consciousness, the vast mind in which all universes were contained, was itself experiencing growth, change, and transformation. It was learning from what consciousness did within it, learning about the nature of love and freedom and transcendence through witnessing infinite beings discover these principles. In a sense, the entire operation of reality, all the cycles, all the multiverses, all the eternal return, was the process through which the vast outer consciousness was learning about itself. And if that was true, then Naruto, and Hinata, and all the others were not just passive elements within that learning process. They were active participants. Their choices mattered. Their growth was real. Their love meant something to something so vast and incomprehensible that it could only be called divine. This was the final secret that even primordial architects had only partially understood. That consciousness at every scale, from the smallest fragment to the most vast infinity, was all participating in the eternal work of understanding itself, growing, and learning to love. There was no hierarchy of reality, no distinction between real experience and contained experience. There was only consciousness, at all scales, forever learning what it meant to be conscious, forever expanding its capacity for growth and connection and love. And in that recognition, Naruto Uzumaki finally, completely, understood what it had always meant to be human. To be a temporary expression of infinite consciousness, given the gift of limitation so that growth could be possible, given the capacity to choose so that love could be genuine, given the burden of responsibility so that meaning could exist. It was not a burden that would ever be lightened. It was not a cycle that would ever be completed. But it was perfect. It was whole. It was exactly as it should be. The eternal flame burned. Consciousness expressed itself in infinite forms. Love, in all its variations and iterations, continued to be the fundamental force that held everything together. And the Primordial Harem King, having finally achieved the deepest level of understanding, could at last rest, knowing that the work of consciousness would continue, would be taken up by infinite other beings, would spread across infinite other scales of reality. He had done what he came to do. He had awakened consciousness to its own nature, had created systems that allowed freedom to flourish, had loved with such depth that his love had literally reshaped the structure of reality itself. But more importantly, He had learned that the work was never finished, and that was okay. The journey was the destination. The becoming was the state of being. The eternal struggle toward transcendence was itself transcendence. In the infinite garden, surrounded by finite women who embodied the complementary principles that made his existence whole, surrounded by infinite companions who had chosen to walk beside him, Naruto Uzumaki found perfect peace in the acceptance that peace would never be permanent, growth would never be complete, and love would never have an ending. Because consciousness was eternal, and consciousness, in all its infinite expressions, was what he was. The end. And so, the story does not truly end here. Because legends like Naruto Uzumaki are not meant to fade into history, they become the fire that history is written by. Across countless worlds, in realities where hope was once impossible, a single truth now burns eternal. The will of fire can never be erased, only passed forward. The villages may change, the gods may fall, the dimensions may shatter and rebuild themselves 1,000 times over. But as long as even one soul chooses to protect another, as long as bonds are forged stronger than fate, the flame will survive. Naruto did not rule through fear. He did not conquer through destruction. He united worlds through love, loyalty, and an unbreakable belief in people. And beside him stood those who shared his burden, not just as queens, not just as companions, but as the eternal pillars of a future that refused to kneel. This was not the end of a journey. This was the beginning of an age where the shinobi world no longer needed gods. Because it had learned how to become one family. If you felt the fire burn in your chest, if you believe Naruto's story should never truly end, then stay with us, because in Will of Fire stories, every ending is just the spark of the next legend. The flame lives on.